will be dead before this testimony is read by anyone who matters, so I will not waste what remains of my time on the version I have told for 60 years. The version I have told for 60 years is the one the inquest preferred. Fog, navigational error, 5 riders lost to crevasse falls on an unstable glacier. That version is in the military record. It is sealed, but it exists. If you are hearing this, someone has opened the seal, or I have outlived it. Either way, the truth has waited long enough, and I have not. My name is Edric Velen. I am 81. I am dying in a sanatorium in the coastal district of Brynmouth, which is as far south as a man can go and still be on the continent. And I chose it because it is as far from the Kelvarn Glacier as I could get without crossing water. That should tell you something about what I'm going to describe. 16 people entered the Kelvarn Glacier on the 14th of Greenmere, 1431. 12 riders, 4 ground surveyors, 12 war dragons. I was the youngest rider in the formation, 21 years old, 3 years bonded, 4,000 hours of flight time logged with a mount I trusted more than any officer, any instrument, any doctrine the 6th Aerial Division had ever printed and bound and handed to me as though paper could teach a man to read the sky. My dragon's name was Voss. He was 7 years old. I need you to remember his name, because this testimony is not about the glacier. It is not about the creature beneath the glacier. It is about what Voss knew, and when he knew it, and what I failed to understand, until it was too late for 5 men who should have come home. 7 riders returned on the morning of the 16th. 7 dragons returned. The arithmetic appears to balance until you look at the saddles. Of the 7 dragons that walked off the ice that morning, 4 carried their riders. 3 walked in formation with their lances stowed, their harnesses buckled, and their saddles empty. 3 riderless dragons. I need you to understand what that means. A bonded war dragon does not lose its rider and walk calmly in formation. A bonded dragon whose rider falls will dive after the body. A bonded dragon whose rider dies will circle the death site for days, will not eat, will not sleep, will scream until its throat closes or a handler sedates it by force. I have seen this. Twice. The grief of a bonded dragon is the most violent mourning I have witnessed in any living creature, human or otherwise. These 3 dragons did not grieve. They walked off the glacier calmly, in step, as though their riders had simply unbuckled and told them to go home. That is not how a dragon behaves when it loses its rider. That is how a dragon behaves when it has been released from a bond by something the dragon recognizes as having the authority to do so. I have never said that word aloud before. Released. I am saying it now because I'm 81, and the physician tells me I have weeks. And the 5 men inside the Kelvarn Glacier deserve one person, one living person, to say what actually happened on that ice before the last witness dies in a sanatorium bed facing south. The official inquest, convened on the 29th of Greenmere under Commandant Aldrich Pred's authority, ruled the losses attributable to navigational failure, compounded by sudden fog conditions in the upper Glacier Basin. I countersigned that ruling. I was 21. I was frightened not of the military, not of the commandant, not of the discipline that would follow a contradicting report. I was frightened because the truth was worse than any punishment. The truth was that something lives beneath the Kelvarn Valley that is older than the mountains, and my dragon knew it was there before we landed. And I struck it in the face with a thermal lance rated for 8,000 degrees. And the ice healed in 3 seconds. And it looked at me. I will come back to this. I will come back to the 11 seconds. I will describe them exactly. And it chose not to respond. That is the part no one would believe. Not the creature, not the glacier, not the impossible ice, or the 9,000-year dating, or the fact that the mountains grew around it. The part no one would believe is that I hit it with everything I had, and it did not hit back. People can accept monsters. People cannot accept indifference. They cannot accept that the most important moment of a man's life was, to the other party involved, not worth acknowledging. But I'm not starting there. I'm starting with Voss. I'm starting with the valley rim, 2,000 feet above the Kelvarn Basin, on the afternoon of the 14th of Greenmere, when my dragon looked down at the ground, and I did not understand what he was telling me. I understand now. I have understood for 60 years. On the afternoon of the 14th of Greenmere, 1431, the 12 riders of the Kelvarn Cartographic Military Survey cleared the Ashward Ridge and saw the glacier for the first time. I need to describe what should have been there. The Kelvarn Basin is, or was, a temperate valley, wheat country, 3 villages, a river called the Sorrel fed by mountain snowmelt, grazing land on the lower slopes, a tree line of white ash and mountain oak that ran from the valley floor to roughly 4,000 feet. I had never been to the Kelvarn Basin, but I had studied the survey charts from the previous mapping, completed 11 years earlier in 1420. Those charts showed a green valley with a river and a road and the kinds of careful hatch marks cartographers use to indicate cultivated land. The charts showed a place where people lived and farmed and did not look up at the mountains with anything more than the ordinary attention a farmer gives to weather. What we saw from the Ashward Ridge was not that valley. The glacier filled the basin like water fills a bowl, white, unbroken. A sheet of ice stretching from the base of the northern ridge to within a half-mile of the southern tree line, covering every field, every road, every foundation where a village had stood 18 months prior. The river Sorrel was visible only as a faint dark line beneath the ice. Near the valley's eastern edge, frozen solid, not on the surface but throughout. A column of black ice inside a bed of white. The 3 villages were gone, not ruined, not buried. Gone. The ice had covered them so completely that no roofline, no chimney, no stone wall interrupted the surface. It was as though the valley had never been inhabited, as though the glacier had not advanced over human settlement, but had simply replaced it, had filled the space where people lived with something older and more permanent, and had smoothed the surface flat behind it. The survey charts from 1420 showed no ice in the Kelvarn Basin. Not a trace. The basin sits at an elevation of 1,900 feet, well below the glacial threshold for this latitude, which the University of Arranmore's climatological tables place at 6,000 feet minimum. There's no geological model that produces a glacier at 1,900 feet in a temperate zone. The Kelvarn Glacier should not exist. It does. It has existed for approximately 18 months at the time of our arrival, having first been reported by a mail courier in the autumn of 1429 as an unusual frost that has not melted. By the spring of 1430, the frost was a glacier. By the autumn of 1430, the glacier had consumed the valley. By Greenmere of 1431, the military sent us. I tell you this so you understand. We were not looking for a creature. We were looking for an explanation. The 12 riders and 4 ground surveyors of the Kelvarn expedition were assembled to answer a cartographic question. Why is there ice where there should not be ice? The University of Arranmore attached a geologist, Marin Duval, to provide academic analysis. The military attached Commandant Prade to provide authority and, if necessary, threat assessment. The Kelvarn district governor attached a local guide, a shepherd named Torek Anis, to provide basin-specific terrain knowledge. 16 people, 12 dragons, a standard survey package with a standard mandate. Map the glacier, determine its origin, assess its trajectory, and file a report. I was the youngest rider. I had been bonded with Voss since he was 3. He was a gray mount breed fast, compact for a war mount, 11-foot wingspan, built for reconnaissance rather than siege work. His scales were the color of river stone in rain, a dark mottled gray that turned nearly black in low light. I had chosen him from a clutch of 6 because he was the only hatchling that watched me before I entered the pen. The other 5 reacted when I stepped through the gate. Voss was already watching. He had tracked me through the fence slats from 30 feet away, and when I knelt in front of him, he did not approach. He assessed, He took 4 full seconds, I counted, even then. Even at 18, before he walked to me and pressed his head against my sternum. The bonding handler said she had never seen a hatchling deliberate. She said Voss was not choosing me. He was deciding whether to choose me. The distinction mattered to her. It did not matter to me at 18. It matters to me at 81, because that 4-second deliberation was the first time I saw Voss exercise judgment, and I did not recognize it for what it was. The behavior of an animal, whose intelligence operates on a longer timeline than its riders. I tell you about the bond because the bond is the instrument. Everything I'm about to describe, the tracks, the core samples, the breathing, the shape in the ice. I observed those things with human eyes and human instruments, and they are in my testimony as facts. But the first evidence, the earliest evidence, the evidence that preceded every anomaly by hours or days, was Voss. Voss was the instrument I should have read. He was calibrated to something I could not perceive, tuned to a frequency below human detection, and from the moment we cleared the Ashward Ridge, he was telling me what was in that valley. I did not listen. I am listening now, 60 years too late, in a room that smells of salt and linen. I am listening to what Voss said on the afternoon of the 14th of Greenmere. He looked down. I need to be precise about this. A war dragon in flight maintains a scanning pattern, head sweeping left-right in a 60-degree arc, eyes tracking the horizon for threats, occasionally dipping to check terrain directly below before returning to the sweep. This is trained behavior, reinforced over years, so consistent that a rider can feel the rhythm of the scan through the neck muscles without looking. I could feel Voss's scan the way you feel your own breathing automatically, subconsciously, a background rhythm that tells you the system is operating normally. On the Ashward Ridge, the scan stopped. Voss's head fixed downward. Not at the glacier. We were still 2,000 feet above the basin, and the glacier was visible as a white mass below and ahead. But Voss was not looking at the glacier. He was looking at the ground directly beneath us. The ridge. The stone. He was looking through the ridge at something below it. Or he was looking at the ridge itself, as though the stone had changed, as though the rock beneath his flight path contained information it had not contained 10 minutes earlier. I checked his neck muscles. Taut. Not the tautness of alarm. I knew Voss's alarm state. Had felt it twice in live combat situations. And it was a sharp contraction, followed by a turn toward the threat source. This was sustained. Even the tautness of attention. Voss was paying attention to something beneath us, with an intensity I had only seen in one other context, when a juvenile dragon encounters a mature alpha in territorial airspace. The juvenile does not fight, does not flee. It goes still. It watches. It calculates whether the alpha has noticed it, and, if so, whether the alpha considers it worth responding to. I had seen that stillness in young dragons at the breeding grounds outside Moor. When a wild alpha, 30 years old, scarred, ridge-backed, crossed the thermal column above the pens. Every juvenile in the yard went still, not afraid, attentive, aware that something above them on every hierarchy that mattered was present, and that their survival depended on being noticed as little as possible. Voss was 7 years old, and he was displaying that stillness 2,000 feet above a valley that, according to every chart I carried, contained nothing but wheat fields and a river and a glacier that should not be there. I attributed it to fatigue. We had been flying for 6 hours on the approach from the eastern garrison. I adjusted his saddle. I checked his joints, shoulders, elbows, the fine bones of the wing wrist, where strain accumulates on long flights. Everything was sound. I pressed my palm to the side of his neck and felt his heartbeat. Elevated. Not combat elevated. The slow, thick elevation of sustained focus. The heartbeat of an animal that has identified something important and is devoting every available resource to tracking it. I told myself it was the glacier. New terrain, unusual visual, an ice mass where the charts showed green. Of course, Voss was alert. I told myself this, and I logged it in my flight notes as Mount Alert, possible terrain novelty response. And I flew on. I did not ask myself the question I should have asked. The question Voss was answering with his entire body, with his fixed gaze and his locked neck and his slow, thick heartbeat. What is below us that is large enough and old enough and high enough on the hierarchy that a war-trained dragon treats the stone itself as a threshold? Voss knew. He knew before we descended. He knew before any instrument or human eye registered the first anomaly. I was trained to read him. I failed. Before dusk on the 14th, the expedition established its base camp at the glacier's southern edge, where the ice met the valley's remaining tree line. The transition was a line, not a gradual fade from grass to frost to ice, but a clean demarcation, as sharp as a wall's shadow on a sunlit floor. On one side, grass, brown and dormant but alive, root systems intact, soil temperature registering at a seasonal 9 degrees. On the other, ice, white and featureless, and registering at minus 41 degrees on Marin Duval's field thermometer. A 50-degree differential across a boundary you could straddle with your feet. I stood on that line. My left boot was on frozen grass. My right boot was on ice. I could feel the difference through the leather, not just temperature, but density. The grass side gave slightly under my weight, the way living ground does. The ice side did not give at all. It was not slippery. It was not brittle. It was solid in a way that felt less like frozen water and more like stone that happened to be white and cold. Marin Duval knelt at the boundary and examined it for 20 minutes before speaking. She was 43, a field geologist from the University of Arranmore, who had published 2 monographs on glacial advance patterns in the northern ranges. She had been selected for the expedition because she was, according to the university's recommendation letter, the most qualified living authority on anomalous ice formation in temperate zones. She was a short woman with a surveyor's posture, shoulders level, head still, eyes that moved in the same scanning pattern Voss used in flight. When she stood up from the boundary line, she did not address Commandant Prade or the assembled riders. She wrote in her journal. I was close enough to see the page. She wrote a single sentence and underlined it twice. I could not read the words from my angle, but I saw the underlines, 2 firm strokes beneath a sentence that took her less than 5 seconds to write. Whatever she had concluded in 20 minutes of examination, she expressed in 1 sentence. She did not share it. I did not ask. I wish I had. Commandant Aldrich Prade was 51, a career officer in the 6th Aerial Division who had commanded survey expeditions to the northern ice shelves and the volcanic ridges of the Ashen Mere. He was competent in the way that military competence sometimes manifests. Thorough, procedural, and constitutionally incapable of classifying anything as unprecedented. Prade's reports, which I had read during the expedition briefing, were notable for their refusal to encounter the unknown. Every anomaly was reclassified. Every mystery was a measurement error. Every unexplained phenomenon was explained, in Prade's steady hand, as a known phenomenon observed under unusual conditions. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man whose mind had a filing system that did not contain a drawer labeled impossible. And so impossible things were filed under the nearest possible equivalent, and the drawer was shut. Prade examined the boundary line after Marin and declared it consistent with a sharp front glacial advance unusual but documented in the northern ranges, where katabatic winds can drive an ice sheet forward along a clean leading edge. Marin, still writing, did not respond. I watched her pen stop moving when Prade said katabatic. She did not correct him. She did not look up. She resumed writing after he finished. And I understood, though I was only 21, and did not have the language for it then, that Marin had heard Prade's explanation and had chosen not to spend the energy required to dismantle it. That choice, that silence, told me more than her journal ever would. Marin Duval was not a woman who tolerated inaccuracy. If she let Praed's explanation stand without challenge, it was because she had already concluded that the truth was so far from Praed's framework that correction was a waste of breath. Torek Annis arrived at the camp on foot as the riders were unsaddling the dragons. He had walked from the village of Greyvale, 7 miles east, where the last Kelvarn Basin residents had resettled after the glacier consumed their farmland. He was 64 years old, lean, bearded, his face wind-cut in the way of men who have spent their lives on exposed slopes. He carried a walking staff made of white ash, the same species as the trees that line the glacier's southern edge, and a pack containing dried provisions, a wool sleeping roll, and nothing else. No survey equipment, no instruments, no weapons. I learned later that Torek had been offered payment for his services as a guide. He had declined the payment and agreed to guide for free. When Marin asked him why, in a conversation I overheard on the second evening, Torek said, "Payment is for services. I am not providing a service, I am providing a warning. You do not pay a man for warning you." Torek's value to the expedition, as Praed understood it, was local terrain knowledge, footpaths, water sources, rock stability, the practical geography of a man who had walked the Kelvarn Basin for 60 years. This was not wrong, but it was incomplete in a way that Praed could not have known. Torek's knowledge was not limited to terrain. It was ecological. He had spent 6 decades observing everything that moved in the basin: weather, water, wildlife, and, critically, dragons. The Kelvarn Range had a wild dragon population. Not large, perhaps 40 to 50 individuals, roosting in the high coals above 7,000 feet, subsisting on mountain goats and thermal updrafts. They were stoneback breeds, smaller than war mounts, non-migratory, territorial within their coal, but indifferent to the valley below. The Kelvarn shepherds had coexisted with them for generations. Torek had observed dragon behavior his entire life, not as a trainer or a bonding specialist, but as a neighbor. He knew their seasonal patterns, their hunting schedules, their mating calls, their territorial disputes. He knew which coals were occupied and which were contested. He knew the sound a stoneback makes when it is content, and the sound it makes when it is alarmed, and the sound of a low, sustained vibration felt in the chest, rather than heard in the ear, that it makes when it encounters something it considers an authority. On the evening of the 14th, as the riders were establishing camp, Torek walked along the picket line where the 12 war dragons were tethered. He walked slowly. He looked at each dragon in turn, not at the animals themselves, but at their postures, their head positions, their wing carriage. He spent perhaps 30 seconds in front of each mount, studying it the way Marin had studied the boundary line, with the focused attention of a specialist reading data in a medium invisible to non-specialists. He stopped in front of Voss. Voss was standing with his head lowered, not in the resting posture of a tethered dragon waiting to be fed, but in the sustained downward orientation I had noticed on the ridge. Chin tucked, eyes fixed on the ground, neck muscles taut. Every other dragon on the line was exhibiting some version of normal tether behavior. Head bobbing, wing adjustment, the low grumbling vocalizations of animals settling for the evening. Voss was silent and still. Torek stood in front of him for a long time. Then he turned to Marin, not to Praed, not to me, not to any of the riders, and said, quietly enough that I had to step closer to hear, "Your war mount knows. They always know before the riders. The old code speaks to dragons. It is why we never bonded with them. The bond would have told us too much." Marin asked what he meant. Torek said the wild stonebacks had abandoned the Kelvarn Range 6 months before the glacier appeared. Not fled abandoned. They left their coals calmly, in orderly succession, over the course of a single week, flying south toward the gray mist lowlands where no stoneback had roosted in living memory. They left their nesting sites, their territorial markers, their hunting grounds. They left the way a tenant leaves when the landlord returns without argument, without haste, without looking back. Torek said he had watched dragons his entire life, and he had never seen them vacate. He had seen them fight for territory, kill for territory, starve rather than abandon a coal in a lean season. Stonebacks do not leave. They are the most territorial breed documented in the University of Arranmore's bestiary. And yet, 6 months before the glacier surfaced, every stoneback in the Kelvarn Range departed, peacefully, completely, as though they had received a signal, not a threat, not a warning, but a notification that the territory they occupied was no longer theirs. Prade was briefed on the wild dragon departure. He logged it as a seasonal migration pattern disruption, likely triggered by seismic activity preceding glacial formation. Maren said nothing. Torek watched Prade write the entry and said nothing. I watched Torek's face as he watched Prade write, and I saw the expression I would come to recognize over the next 2 days as Torek's default response to Prade's classifications, the patient silence of a man who knows that correction is pointless because the error is not factual but categorical. Prade was not getting the facts wrong. He was filing them in the wrong drawer. And the right drawer, the drawer labeled with a word in Torek's language that I would not learn for 30 years, did not exist in Prade's system. On that first evening, Torek showed Maren and 2 of the senior riders, though not Prade, the tree line at the glacier's southern edge. The white ash and mountain oak that had marked the boundary of the valley's habitable zone were dead. This was expected. The glacier's advance would have killed any vegetation in its path through temperature exposure. What was not expected was the manner of death. The trees had not frozen gradually. Sap analysis, which Maren conducted in the field with a hand lens and a sample blade, showed crystallization at the molecular level. Sap frozen so rapidly that its structure was preserved in mid-flow. Sugars locked in transit between cells, the chemical signature of a living tree captured in the instant of death. The leaves, summer leaves, full and green at the time of freezing, now preserved in translucent ice sheath, were still attached. Autumn had not reached them. They had been alive on a summer afternoon and dead by that same evening. Maren estimated the freezing event had lasted less than 1 second. She said the word instantaneous and then corrected herself. Functionally instantaneous. There is no mechanism I'm aware of that produces this result on biological tissue at this latitude and elevation. Torek nodded. He said his grandmother's grandmother had described the same trees, the same death. He said, last time, the way a man says last winter, as a recurrence, a cycle, an event that had happened before and would happen again because it was not an anomaly, but a schedule. Maren asked when last time was. Torek calculated using generational markers. His grandmother's grandmother had been a child. 4 generations, roughly 400 years. Maren wrote the number in her journal and circled it. Then Torek showed them what Maren had not yet noticed. He knelt at the base of one of the dead ash trees and cleared the soil with his hands. The roots were visible within inches of the surface, white, brittle, frozen. Maren knelt beside him and followed a root down with her sample blade. Frozen. She went deeper. Still frozen. She reached the frost line, the depth below which ground temperature in the Kelvarn Basin should remain above freezing year-round, and the root was still frozen. The cold had not descended from the surface. It had not spread outward from the glacier's leading edge. It had come from below. The roots had frozen from the bottom up, the deepest tissue first, then the trunk, then the branches, then the leaves. The tree had died from its feet, not its crown. Maren sat back on her heels and looked at the glacier. I was close enough to see her face. She was not frightened. She was recalculating. She was a woman whose model of the world had just received a data point that did not fit, and she was doing what scientists do. She was rebuilding the model in real time. The old model said the glacier advanced from the north, freezing the surface as it came. The new data said the cold originated below the valley floor and propagated upward. The glacier had not crept across the Kelvarn Basin. It had surfaced. Something beneath the valley, something that had been there long before the glacier, long before the trees, perhaps long before the valley itself, had risen to the surface and frozen everything above it on the way up. Maren did not share this conclusion. She closed her journal. She looked at Torek, and Torek looked at her, and something passed between them, not a word, not a gesture, just the mutual recognition of two people who have arrived at the same understanding from opposite directions and know that the understanding changes everything. Torek said one more thing that evening. He said it to Maren, not to the group, as they walked back to camp along the tree line, with the dead white ash standing above them like frozen sentinels. He said, "The old cold does not chase. It arrives. It stays. It lets you leave if you leave quickly. We have a protocol for leaving. You walk backward off the ice. You do not turn your back. You do not run. You do not take anything with you. No ice, no stone, no samples." He paused. He looked at Maren's sample case, slung over her shoulder, containing the sap crystals and root sections she had extracted over the past hour. He did not say anything about the case. He did not tell her to put it back. He looked at it, and then he looked at the glacier, and then he walked to the camp and sat beside the fire and did not speak again for the rest of the night. Maren kept the samples. I watched her hand move to the case's buckle twice during the walk back, as though she was going to open it and return the contents to the tree line. Twice she stopped. Twice she kept walking. I do not know what stayed her hand, scientific reflex, professional obligation, the simple human inability to surrender evidence once gathered. I know that she kept the samples. I know that Torek saw her keep them. And I know, because I have had 60 years to reconstruct the chain of consequence, that the keeping of those samples was the first trespass. Not the drilling, not the lance strike, the samples. We took something from the glacier's edge and carried it into our camp, and the thing beneath the ice knew, because it knew everything that happened on its surface, and the account came due on the night of the 16th. But I'm ahead of myself. I must go in order. Voss would want me to go in order. He was an animal who deliberated 4 seconds in the hatchling pen, remember? And I owe him the precision of chronology. On the night of the 14th, I checked Voss before sleeping. He was standing at his tether, facing north, chin low, eyes open, the posture unchanged from the ridge. Every other dragon on the picket line had settled heads tucked, wings folded for sleep, the low rumbling breath of 1,200-pound animals at rest. Voss was silent. His throat was vibrating. I could feel it when I placed my hand on his neck. A deep oscillation below the threshold of hearing, as though his vocal apparatus was producing a sound too low for human ears. I pressed my chest to his shoulder and felt the vibration transfer into my sternum. It was not random. It was rhythmic. A pattern I did not recognize. I attributed it to environmental stress. New terrain, cold air, the proximity of the glacier. I adjusted his tether. I offered water. He did not drink. I told him to sleep an absurd command, the kind of thing riders say to their mounts out of habit. The way a parent tells a child to sleep as though the instruction has ever once been sufficient. And I walked to my bedroll. I did not sleep well. Twice during the night, I woke and looked at the picket line. Both times, Voss was standing, facing north, vibrating at a frequency I could not hear. I did not understand. Not then. Not for a long time. Voss was not stressed. Voss was not afraid. Voss was communicating. He was producing a sound aimed at the glacier or at what was beneath the glacier, and the sound was not a warning or an alarm or a distress call. It was a response. Something beneath the Kelvarn Valley was broadcasting. And Voss, a 7-year-old war dragon, 4,000 hours of flight, bonded to me for 4 years, was answering it. The way a wolf in foreign territory answers when the territory's owner calls. I was trained to read him. I heard the vibration. I felt it in my chest. I called it stress. Torek, I learned later, did not sleep at all that first night. He sat by the fire and watched the dragons. He told Maren the next morning, and she recorded it in her journal, which is how I know that he counted the vibrating mounts. "All 12, he said. "All 12 are answering. The war breeds hear it the same as the wild ones. The training does not remove it. The bond does not override it. Whatever the old code says to dragons, it says it in a language older than any bond a human can offer." On the morning of the 15th of Greenmere, I woke to Marin Duval's voice outside my tent. She was speaking to Commandant Pride in the controlled tone of a woman choosing each word with the awareness that the wrong one would be dismissed before it landed. I did not hear Pride's response. I heard Marin say, "I am not interpreting them. I am measuring them. I would like you to come and measure them yourself." I dressed and followed them to the northern perimeter of the camp, the side facing the glacier's interior. The camp had been established 30 yards from the glacier's southern edge. On the ice itself, Prade had insisted on positioning the base on the survey target rather than the tree line, a standard military cartographic protocol that placed the instruments at the center of the subject terrain. We had slept on the glacier. Our tents were staked into ice that Marin had already noted did not behave like ice. The stakes had required twice the normal force to drive, and once set, they could not be pulled free without a mallet. The ice gripped them. It did not grip them the way frozen water grips metal through thermal adhesion. It gripped them the way wood grips a nail, through structure. The tracks circled the camp at a distance of 40 feet from the outermost tent. They formed a complete ring, a continuous path of footprints that began at no identifiable starting point and ended at no identifiable stopping point, as though the walker had been in motion when it materialized and in motion when it vanished. The footprints were bipedal, 2 feet alternating in a stride pattern as regular as a metronome. I measured them. I have measured very few things in my life with the precision I applied to those footprints, and I've remembered very few measurements with the fidelity I have carried these for 60 years. Each print was 4 feet and 2 inches across at its widest point. Each was sunk 3 inches into the glacier's surface in a clean compression, not cracked, not fractured, not splintered at the edges the way ice fractures under sudden weight. Compressed. The ice at the base of each print was denser than the surrounding surface, as though the weight that produced the impression had been sustained long enough for the ice to yield and resettle rather than break. Stride length, 14 feet, consistent across every measured interval. I measured 11 strides. Marin measured 23. Every stride was 14 feet. Not approximately 14 feet. 14 feet. The precision was mechanical. Marin was kneeling in one of the prints when I arrived. She had her sample blade in one hand and her field thermometer in the other. She was not taking samples. She was staring at the ice inside the footprint with the expression of a woman whose instruments have just told her something her training says is impossible. She looked up at me, not at Prade, who was standing behind her with his arms crossed, but at me and said, "This ice does not accept impressions. I tested it yesterday. I struck it with a geological hammer at full force, no mark. I stood on it, my full weight on a single boot heel, no mark. I dropped a 40-pound survey weight from shoulder height, no mark. This substance does not compress under any force I can generate." She pointed at the footprint. Something compressed it to a depth of 3 inches, uniformly, across a surface area of 4 feet, with enough sustained pressure to restructure the crystal lattice. I cannot produce this result with any equipment in my kit. I cannot produce this result with any equipment at the university. I do not know what can produce this result. She paused. She said, "I know what the result looks like. It looks like a footprint." Commandant Prade examined the tracks. He walked the full circuit, counting strides I watched him count, his lips moving, and returned to the northern perimeter where Marin and I waited. He said the tracks were consistent with thermal stress fracturing. The camp's heat signature, 12 dragons, 16 humans, 4 tents, 2 field forges, had created a thermal gradient at the glacier's surface, producing patterned cracking along stress lines in the ice. The bipedal appearance was coincidental. The regularity of the stride length was a product of the ice's crystalline structure, which would fracture at consistent intervals under uniform thermal stress. Marin said, "Commandant, these are compression marks, not fractures. The ice inside the prints is denser than the surrounding surface. Thermal fractures produce expansion, not compression. The two phenomena are mechanically opposite." Predating said, "Note your objection in your journal, Dr. Duval. I am logging the marks as thermal stress fractures in the expedition survey." Marin noted her objection. Predating logged the marks. The drawer was shut. Torek Anis came to the tracks an hour later. He had been at the glacier's edge since dawn. He had not slept in the camp, had not set foot on the ice after dark, had spent the night sitting by the tree line, with his back to a dead white ash, watching the glacier from its border. He walked to the northern perimeter, looked at the tracks for less than 10 seconds, and said, "The landlord's walk." He did not address Predating. He addressed Marin. He said the creature, the old cold, the thing the Kelvarn shepherds had named in their language, with a word that meant something between landlord and the one to whom the ground answers, circled any new presence on its territory within the first night. It was not a threat display. It was an inventory. The creature was counting them. It now knew how many they were, how many dragons, how many tents, how many heat sources. It knew the shape and weight of the intrusion. Torek said, "It walked around you the way a man walks around a new fence on his land," not angry, assessing. Marin asked if the creature would return. Torek said the creature had not left. The creature was the glacier. The tracks were not evidence that it had visited in the night and departed. The tracks were evidence that a part of it, a limb, a protrusion, a localized expression of something vastly larger, had surfaced, walked the perimeter, and submerged again. The creature was still beneath them. It had been beneath them since they set foot on the ice. The tracks were not an arrival. They were an acknowledgement. Predating was not present for this exchange. I was. I listened, and I felt, beneath the rational architecture of my training, the first structural crack, not fear, not yet, but the recognition that the framework I had been given to process this expedition did not contain this. Thermal stress fractures I could file. An entity beneath the glacier that inventoried our camp by surfacing a limb and walking around us in the dark, there was no drawer for that. Predating did not have one. I did not have one. Voss, I was beginning to understand, did not need one. Voss had known since the ridge. That afternoon, the survey flights resumed. 3 riders at a time, rotating in 2-hour shifts, flying grid patterns over the glacier at an altitude of 800 feet to produce the cartographic framework for Predating's report. I flew the second shift with 2 senior riders, Hallen and Druvis. The glacier from altitude was featureless, white, flat, unbroken, the surface so uniform that depth perception failed, and I had to rely on Voss's altimeter instinct to maintain safe clearance. There were no crevasses, no ridges, no moraines, no evidence of flow or compression, or any of the dynamic features that characterize a living glacier. It was not a glacier in any geological sense. It was a surface smooth, static, and vast, covering the entire valley floor as though poured from above and leveled. Voss flew the grid pattern as commanded. His responses to directional inputs were technically correct: turn radius, bank angle, altitude holds all within standard tolerances. But the half-second delay I had noticed on the ridge was still present. Every command I gave through the reins arrived at Voss's muscles a half-second late, as though each instruction was being received, evaluated, and then reluctantly, after some internal process I could not observe, executed. In 4 years of bonded flight, I had never felt hesitation from Voss. His responses had always been instantaneous, preconscious, the product of a bond so deep that the distinction between my intention and his action had dissolved. Now there was a gap, a half-second of deliberation between my input and his compliance. He was still obeying, but he was no longer agreeing. I told myself it was the altitude, the cold, The unfamiliar terrain. I logged it as minor response latency, likely environmental, and did not mention it to the other riders. The shift ended. I landed Voss at the picket line. He settled into his tether posture, head down, eyes on the glacier's surface, throat vibrating at the same subsonic frequency I had felt the night before. I placed my hand on his neck. The vibration was stronger. Not louder, dragons do not vocalize in volume gradations the way humans do, but denser, as though the signal was becoming more complex, carrying more information in the same frequency band. If I had had Marin's instruments, I might have measured the change. I did not. I had my palm and my sternum, and 4 years of knowing this animal. And what my palm told me was that Voss was engaged in a sustained communication that was becoming more detailed over time. He was not broadcasting a simple signal. He was in a conversation. At dusk, I returned to the northern perimeter to check the tracks. I had told no one I was going. I went because something in me, the part that had listened to Torek, the part that had felt Voss's hesitation, needed to see the tracks again, needed to confirm they were still there, that they were real, that the morning had not been a collective misperception magnified by glacier glare and insufficient sleep. The tracks were still there, but they had changed. At dawn, the circuit had been clockwise, the stride pattern proceeding from left to right as viewed from the camp's center, each footprint's toe orientation indicating a clockwise walker. I had noted this in my measurements, and Marin had noted it independently in her journal. Clockwise. At dusk, the circuit was counterclockwise. The prints were identical in every metric: 4 feet 2 inches wide, 3 inches deep, 14-foot stride, same compression density, same clean edges. But the toe orientation had reversed. The walker had circled the camp again in the opposite direction. At some point during the day, while 12 riders were flying grid patterns overhead and 4 surveyors were conducting surface measurements, and 16 people were awake and present, and no one had seen a thing. The ice had not refrozen and recracked. The prints had not been overwritten by a new set. I checked. There was one set of prints, one circuit. The same prints I had measured that morning. Same depth, same compression, same crystalline restructuring, but facing the other way. The tracks had not been replaced. They had been rotated, as though the glacier had taken the existing impressions and turned them around, as though the surface itself had been edited. I measured them again. Same dimensions, different direction. I wrote the measurements in my personal log, the log that would become this testimony. And I did not tell anyone. Not Marin, not Torek, not Prade. I did not tell anyone because I did not have language for what I had observed, and because the only framework that explained it, Torek's framework, the landlord framework, the framework in which the glacier was not a surface, but a body that could rearrange its own features, was a framework I was not yet willing to enter. Voss was standing at his tether, facing north, vibrating. He had not moved all day. I stood beside him in the dusk and pressed my forehead to his neck, and I felt, through his scales, through the muscle beneath, through the bone beneath that, the vibration, 4 seconds on, 6 seconds off, repeating, patient, ceaseless. I did not recognize the rhythm. I did not count it. I would learn to count it later, would learn it the way a man learns the heartbeat of his own fear, but on the evening of the 15th, standing beside my dragon on a glacier that was rearranging its own footprints, I only knew that Voss was answering something, and the something was close. On the morning of the 15th, the same morning as the tracks, though it felt by then like a different day, in a different month, in a different year, Marin Duval drilled her first core sample from the glacier's center. The drill site was 400 yards north of the camp, chosen because Marin's surface density readings indicated that the glacier's substance was most uniform at that location, fewest air pockets, most consistent refractive index, the purest sample of whatever the glacier was made of. She set up the coring rig with the assistance of 2 surveyors, a hand-cranked rotary drill rated for alpine ice to a depth of 20 feet. Standard equipment. She had used the same rig on 4 previous glacial surveys in the northern ranges. She could core a 20-foot sample in under an hour. The Kelvarn Glacier took 3 hours. The drill did not meet resistance in the conventional sense. The bit did not grind, did not stall, did not encounter the sudden density transitions that characterize normal glacial ice, the compressed layers, the air pocket voids, the gravel inclusions. It advanced smoothly, steadily, at a rate roughly 1/3 of its normal speed, as though the substance it was cutting was not harder than ice, but more continuous, lacking the microfractures and grain boundaries that allow a drill to bite and progress. Maren described it in her journal as cutting into cold flesh. The substance yielded. It did not fracture. It parted around the bit and closed behind it as the core was extracted, leaving a borehole that was, and this detail, which Maren noted with a precision I have come to admire more with every passing year, perfectly cylindrical. No scoring, no tool marks, no evidence of the drill's rotation. The walls of the borehole were as smooth as the glacier's surface, as though the substance had allowed itself to be penetrated and had smoothed the wound behind the instrument. The core sample was 18 inches long, 3 inches in diameter, translucent, and registering at -93 degrees on Maren's thermometer. For reference, the coldest recorded temperature in the northern ice shelves, where glaciers are expected and studied, is -61 degrees. The Kelvarn core was 32 degrees colder than the coldest ice on the continent, extracted from a glacier sitting at 1,900 feet in a temperate valley. Maren attempted to melt a fragment. She placed a 1-inch section on a heated plate at 200 degrees, well above the melting point of any known water ice configuration. The fragment did not melt. She increased the temperature to 400 degrees using the expedition's field forge. The fragment did not melt. She held it in the forge's direct flame, a temperature she estimated at over 600 degrees, for 90 seconds. The fragment remained solid. It was not warm. It was not sweating. It was not exhibiting any of the phase transition indicators that characterize a solid approaching its melting point. It sat in the flame the way a stone sits in a stream, present, unbothered, operating under a different set of rules than the medium surrounding it. Maren withdrew the fragment and examined it under her hand lens. The crystalline structure was unlike any ice she had documented. Water ice H2O in solid phase forms in one of 17 known crystal configurations, all hexagonal at the molecular level, all producing the 6-fold symmetry visible in snowflakes and frost patterns. The Kelvarn substance was not hexagonal. Maren could not identify the geometry. She wrote in her journal that the crystal structure was dense, non-repeating, and self-similar at every magnification I can achieve with field equipment, a description that matches no known substance in the University of Arranmore's Mineral Index. She conducted a chronolithic resonance test, the standard geological method for age-dating crystalline substances, based on the decay rate of embedded chronolithic isotopes. The test requires a sample of at least 1 cubic inch and a calibrated resonance chamber, both of which Maren carried in her field kit. She ran the test 3 times. Each time, the result was the same. The substance was approximately 9,000 years old, plus or minus 200 years. 9,000. The Kelvarn mountain range is 6,000 years old. The geological surveys are unambiguous on this point. The range was formed by tectonic uplift during the Greenmere orogeny, dated by multiple independent methods to approximately 6,000 years before present. The mountains are 6,000 years old. The substance inside the glacier is 9,000 years old. The glacier's material predates the mountains by 3,000 years. Maren read the result, and her hands were still. I was watching from 40 feet away. I had walked to the drill site during a break in the survey flights, drawn by a curiosity I could not name and did not want to examine. I saw her face as she read the resonance data. It was not the face of a woman encountering surprise. It was the face of a woman encountering confirmation, as though the 9,000-year date was not a shock, but the final variable in an equation she had been solving since the tree line. The roots frozen from below, the cold propagating upward, the glacier surfacing rather than advancing. The age completed the picture. This substance was here before the mountains. The mountains rose around it. The valley formed above it. And 18 months ago, for reasons no seismologist or climatologist could explain, it came to the surface. She told the group. She gathered Prade, the senior riders, Torek, and the surveyors at the drill site and read the results aloud. The core's temperature, the failure to melt, the crystal structure, the age. She read them in her academic voice, precise, flat, evidentiary. And when she finished, Prade asked for a second core. Marin drilled a second core. Same results. Temperature, minus 91 degrees. Melt point, not reached at 600 degrees. Crystal structure, non-hexagonal, unidentified. Age, 9,000 years, plus or minus 180. Prade asked for a third core. Marin refused. The refusal was quiet. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue with the commandant's authority. She said, "Commandant, I have drilled 2 cores into a 9,000-year-old substance of unknown composition, whose physical properties are inconsistent with any material in the geological record. It does not melt. It does not fracture. Its crystal structure is not in our taxonomy. I do not believe drilling a third core will change these findings. I also do not believe," and here she paused, and I watched her choose the next word with the care of a woman placing a stone on a scale. "I also do not believe it is appropriate to continue penetrating a substance we do not understand." She did not say trespass. She did not say alive. She said appropriate, which contained both of those ideas and shielded them in academic language that Prade could not dismiss as superstition. Prade did not order a third core. He amended his survey report. The glacier was reclassified from anomalous alpine ice formation to anomalous mineral deposit with ice-analogous visual and thermal properties. The reclassification changed nothing about the glacier. It changed the drawer in Prade's filing system. The glacier was no longer ice behaving strangely. It was a mineral deposit that happened to be cold and white. This was, in its way, more absurd than the truth, but it was an absurdity that Prade's system could contain. And containment was what Prade required. Torek had listened to Marin's report from the edge of the group, standing slightly apart, his staff in his hand, his face composed in the expression I'd come to read as informed patience. When Marin said 9,000 years, Torek nodded once, not in surprise, not in vindication, but in the manner of a man hearing a number he had always known expressed in a language he did not normally use. He said to Marin, not to the group, "We told you. The cold was here before the stone. The stone grew around it. The stone is a guest in the cold's house, the same as the valley, the same as the trees, the same as us." On the morning of the 16th the next day, though by then time had begun to distort, each hour on the glacier carrying the weight of a week, I accompanied Marin back to the drill site. She wanted to photograph the bore holes for her university report. She wanted secondary measurements of the bore hole wall's crystalline structure. She wanted, I think, to confirm that the previous day had happened, that the data was real, that the numbers were not an artifact of altitude sickness or field instrument miscalibration or the kind of shared delusion that isolation and cold can produce in small groups. The bore holes were gone, not refrozen, not filled with snow or meltwater or debris. Gone. The glacier's surface at the drill site was seamless, uniform, featureless, indistinguishable from the surrounding ice in color, texture, density, and temperature. Marin placed her instruments over the site. She checked subsurface density. She checked resonance. She checked for any trace of the rotary drill's passages, scoring, compression, the microfractures that drilling invariably produces in any solid medium. There was nothing. The glacier was unbroken, as though the boreholes had never existed, as though the 3 hours of drilling and the 18-inch cores and the resonance tests and the arguments about the third core had happened to a different glacier, in a different valley, on a different day. Maren ran her hand over the surface, where the first borehole had been. She was trembling not from cold, not from fear, but from the specific tremor of a scientist whose instruments have just told her something her discipline does not have a category for. She pressed her palm flat against the ice and held it there. Then she said, without looking at me, in a voice as level and empty as the glacier's surface, "The drill holes are healed, not refrozen. Healed. Refreezing leaves thermal scarring. There is no thermal scarring. The substance repaired itself at the molecular level. It regenerated its crystal structure across the full depth of the bore. This is not a geological process. This is a biological process. Things that heal are alive, Velen." She opened her sample case. The 3 core samples, 2 18-inch cylinders, and several fragments from the melt tests were still inside, packed in insulating cloth. She touched one of the cylinders. She pulled her hand back. She touched it again. Then she looked at me and said, "They are warm. Not warm the way a substance approaches ambient temperature when insulated. Not warm the way ice softens in the sun. Warm the way skin is warm." The core samples, extracted from a substance registering at -93 degrees, stored in a sealed case for 18 hours, were warm to the touch. Not hot, not room temperature, body temperature, 37 degrees. The temperature of living tissue in a mammalian body. Maren closed the case. She buckled it. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "We drilled into something that healed. The samples we took are still alive. They are maintaining their own temperature independent of their environment." Velen, do you understand what I'm saying? These are not samples. They are pieces. We removed pieces of a living organism, and they are still alive, in my case. She did not open the case again for the remainder of the expedition. She carried it with her. I saw it on her shoulder at every subsequent moment. Its weight a constant. But she did not open it. I believe she was afraid that opening it would constitute a further intrusion, that looking at the pieces was, in some way she could not articulate, and I could not have understood at 21. An act of continued trespass against something that had already demonstrated it could undo what had been done to it, and had chosen, so far, not to undo them. Voss was at the picket line when I returned from the drill site. He had moved. In 20 hours of observation, Voss had not left his tether position. He had stood, faced north, and vibrated. He had not eaten. He had not drunk. He had not shifted his weight or adjusted his wings or performed any of the small maintenance behaviors that a tethered dragon executes automatically throughout the day. He had been a statue, a gray-scaled, 1,200-pound statue aimed at the glacier's interior. Now he had moved. He had walked the tether, allowed 12 feet of lateral movement to the northern extent of his range, and was standing at the full length of the chain, his body angled toward the drill site, his head low, his throat producing a vocalization I had never heard from him in 4 years of bond. It was low, sustained, almost below the range of hearing, and it was not the subsonic vibration of the previous 2 nights. It was something else, something with structure, tonal variation, rhythmic modulation, the characteristics of a vocalization that is not a signal, but a phrase. Maren, who was walking beside me, stopped. She had her sonic equipment in her kit. She unclipped her frequency gauge and held it toward Voss. She watched the needle for 30 seconds. Her face changed. "He is matching the glacier's ambient frequency," she said. "The subsurface hum I measured yesterday, the resonance that pervades the entire ice mass. Your dragon is producing the same frequency. Not approximately. Exactly. He is harmonizing with it." I stood in front of Voss. His eyes were open, focused on the middle distance, not tracking me. I placed my hands on either side of his jaw. and turned his head toward me gently, the way a bonding handler redirects a juvenile's attention. Voss's eyes found mine. He was present. He was aware of me, but he was also elsewhere, engaged in something that required more of his processing than I had ever competed with. I was asking for his attention and receiving a fraction of it. The rest was committed to the frequency, to the conversation. I tried to lead him back to the center of his tether range. He did not move. I pulled. He did not move. I leaned my full weight against his neck, 170 pounds, against 1,200, and he was stone, not resisting, not bracing against me, simply not moving, the way a tree does not move when a child pushes it. My effort did not register. For the first time in 4 years, I gave Voss a direct command, and he refused. I am not speaking of the half-second delay. The delay was disobedience in slow motion, a hesitation, a reluctance, a pause before compliance. This was refusal. I told Voss to step back. He did not step back. I told him again. He did not step back. I used the command voice, the low, firm tone that bonding protocol designates for non-negotiable directives. The voice a rider uses in combat when the margin between a command and its execution is the margin between living and dying. Voss heard the command voice. I know he heard it because his ear membranes flattened the involuntary response to a dominant vocalization. He heard me. He registered the authority. And he chose, for the first time in our bond, to remain where he was. He was not disobeying me. I understood this later, years later, decades later, and I need you to understand it now. Voss was not defying his rider. He was prioritizing. The frequency from the glacier, the signal from whatever was beneath the ice, had a claim on his attention that superseded my authority. Not because it was louder, not because it was threatening, not because it was overriding his training through force or fear, because it was higher. Higher on a hierarchy I did not know existed. A hierarchy that predated the bonding system, predated domestication, predated, if the 9,000-year date was accurate, the entire history of human-dragon partnership. Voss was answering to something older than our bond. And our bond, strong as it was, intimate as it was, 4,000 hours deep as it was, could not compete. Torek was watching from the fire. He had seen me fail to move Voss. He walked over slowly, his staff tapping the ice, his breath steady, and stood beside me. He looked at Voss. He looked at the glacier. He said, "Your war mount is listening to the landlord. You cannot interrupt a conversation between a dragon and the thing that owns the ground it stands on. You are his rider. The old cold is his elder. When an elder speaks, the young one does not turn away, even if his rider asks." I asked Torek if the wild stonebacks had behaved this way before they left the valley. He said yes. In the weeks before their departure, they had stopped hunting, stopped territorial disputes, stopped all normal behavior, and oriented toward the valley floor. They stood on their coals and looked down. They vibrated. They harmonized. And then, one by one, they left calmly, silently, as though the conversation had ended and the instruction had been received. "The instruction," Maren said. She had been listening. "You are saying the glacier, the entity, instructed the wild dragons to leave." Torek considered this. He said, "I am saying the dragons heard something and responded. Whether it was an instruction or an invitation or simply a fact, the cold is rising, the territory is changing. Adjust accordingly, I do not know. I am a shepherd. I observe behavior. I do not interpret motive. But I will tell you what I observed. 47 stonebacks left the Kelvarn range in a single week, in an orderly succession, without conflict, without distress, and without a single one returning. In 60 years of watching dragons, I have never seen anything like it. And now your 12 war mounts, trained, bonded, armored, bred for obedience, are doing the same thing the stonebacks did. They are listening to something older than you. That evening, Maren conducted a quiet survey of the picket line. She measured each dragon's subsonic output using her frequency gauge. She recorded the data in her journal. All 12 dragons were producing the same frequency. Not similar, identical. 12 war dragons of 4 different breeds, ranging in age from Voss's 7 years to the senior mount. Predating rode at 19, all producing a harmonic tone that matched the glacier's ambient resonance to within a margin of error so small that Marin's equipment could not distinguish the signals. She wrote one sentence at the bottom of the entry. I saw it years later, when I returned to Kelvarn and found fragments of her work in the university archive. The sentence read, 12 dragons, 4 breeds, 12 years of age variance, identical frequency output. This is not learned behavior. This is not trained. This is phylogenetic. It is in their biology. The response to this stimulus is older than domestication. The dragons have always known. At sunset on the 15th of Greenmere, the glacier began to breathe. I use the word deliberately. I have used it in every version of this testimony I have attempted, including the 4 times I told the inquest lie, because even in the lie, I could not bring myself to reclassify the sound. Predating called it subglacial cavitation, the movement of air or water through chambers beneath the ice, producing resonant tones that propagate through the glacier's mass and emerge at the surface as audible vibration. It is a real phenomenon. It occurs in alpine glaciers where meltwater carves channels through the ice base, creating organ pipe resonance chambers that can produce sounds ranging from deep groaning to high-pitched whistling, depending on chamber geometry and air pressure. The Kelvarn sound was not cavitation. It began at sunset, not gradually, not building from a subaudible hum to a perceptible tone, but all at once, as though someone had opened a valve. One moment the glacier was silent. The next, it was producing a sound that I felt before I heard a vibration that entered my body through my feet, traveled up my spine, and settled in my sternum before my eardrums registered anything at all. The sound arrived in my bones before it arrived in my ears. I have thought about this for 60 years. Sound travels faster through solids than through air. What I felt was the vibration transmitting through the glacier's substance and through the boot soles and bone structure of my legs. What I heard, a fraction of a second later, was the same vibration transmitting through the atmosphere. The delay between feeling and hearing was the delay between solid body and air body propagation. This means the sound was originating inside the glacier and reaching the surface simultaneously across its entire area. It was not a point source. It was not coming from a cavern or a chamber or a channel. It was coming from everywhere beneath us at once. I timed the intervals. I do not know why I timed them. I was not a scientist. I had no training in acoustics or geology or resonance analysis. I was a 21-year-old rider standing on a glacier that was vibrating beneath my boots, and I reached for the only tool I had, the same tool I used to measure Voss's heartbeat, the same tool I used to count strides in the footprints, the same tool that has been my only reliable companion in 60 years of testimony that no one wanted to hear. I counted. 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, repeating. The in phase was a low, sustained tone, not a single frequency but a chord, multiple tones so close together that they merged into a single felt pressure rather than a hard note. The out phase was the same chord in reverse, the same tones releasing, the pressure in my sternum easing, the air around the camp seeming to expand as though something enormous was exhaling, and the atmosphere was making room. 4 seconds of compression, 6 seconds of release. The cycle was 10 seconds, 6 cycles per minute. The rhythm was as regular as a resting heartbeat, as regular as breathing. I pressed my palm to the glacier's surface. I could feel the vibration directly through the ice, through my glove, into the bones of my hand. The surface pulsed. Not visually, the ice did not rise and fall, did not flex or deform in any way I could see, but tactilely, through sustained contact, I could feel a pressure wave moving through the glacier's substance in time with the sound. A pulse, not a heartbeat. Slower than a heartbeat. Deeper. The pulse of something whose biology operated on a timescale that made a human cardiac rhythm look like the frantic ticking of an insect's wings. The dragons responded instantaneously. Every mount on the picket line, all 12, simultaneously, within the span of a single breath, changed posture. Not gradually, not individually. As a unit. 12 heads lowered. 24 wings pressed flat against 12 flanks. 12 sets of forelegs shifted into a wider stance, lowering the center of gravity, pressing the chest toward the ground. 12 dragons, in the same second, assumed the juvenile submission posture I'd seen in the breeding pens outside Aranmore. I need to be precise about what this posture means. In dragon behavioral science, the juvenile submission posture is documented in exactly one context. When a young dragon unbonded, untrained, pre-domestication encounters a mature alpha of overwhelming dominance. The posture signals hierarchical acknowledgement. I am below you. I am not a threat. I am not competing. I submit. It is an involuntary response. The dragon does not choose it the way a soldier chooses to salute. It is triggered by the perception of a specific combination of stimuli: size, age, territorial authority, and a pheromonal or subsonic signature that the juvenile's nervous system reads as dominant beyond challenge. War training is designed to suppress this response. 4 years of bonding, combat conditioning, and hierarchical override training are intended to ensure that a war dragon submission circuit answers to its rider and to nothing else. The entire military dragon program is built on the premise that the bond supersedes all prior biological programming. On the evening of the 15th of Greenmere, 4 years of training and 4,000 hours of bond vanished in less than a second. Voss, my Voss, the dragon who had deliberated for 4 seconds before choosing me, who had flown through arrow storms without flinching, who had never lowered his head for any living thing, including me, lowered his head to the ice and pressed his wings against his flanks and went still. Not the attentive stillness of the previous 2 days. A deeper stillness, the stillness of an animal that has identified something so far above it on every hierarchy that movement itself becomes an impertinence. I knelt beside him. I put my hands on his jaw. His eyes were open. He was conscious, responsive. His pupils tracked my movement. His ear membranes adjusted to my voice. He knew I was there. He heard me. But his body was not mine. His body was answering the sound. And the sound was telling his body something that 4 years of bond could not countermand. You are in the presence of your superior. Be still. I have flown Voss through arrow storms. I have felt his muscles coil beneath me as anti-dragon ballista bolts passed close enough to hear the fletching. He has never lowered his head. He has never pressed his wings. He has faced siege engines and cavalry formations and the full scream of a battlefield, and responded to everyone with the trained, furious defiance that a war dragon is built to deliver. He lowered his head for a sound, a vibration, the breathing of something beneath the ice. Whatever was down there outranked everything Voss had ever faced. Everything, including me. Commandant Prade ordered a sonic survey. 2 of the ground surveyors set up the expedition's acoustic measurement equipment, a resonance frame, a frequency gauge, and a propagation timer that measured the speed of sound through a medium by calculating the delay between a generated pulse and its return echo. Standard glaciological equipment. Marin assisted with calibration. The instruments malfunctioned. Not through damage. The equipment was functional. The calibrations were correct. The operators were competent. The instruments malfunctioned because the sound they were attempting to measure exceeded their design parameters. The frequency gauge, calibrated for glacial resonance between 20 and 200 Hz, could not register the glacier's output. The needle sat at the bottom of the scale, below the minimum threshold, vibrating against the zero stop. The sound was below 20 hertz. How far below? The gauge could not say. Maren calculated it manually. She used the propagation timer to measure the sound's wavelength, the physical distance between wave peaks as the vibration traveled through the glacier's substance. She timed the propagation speed. She divided. The resulting frequency was approximately 0.7 hertz, 7/10 of a cycle per second. For reference, the lowest frequency a human ear can perceive is approximately 20 hertz. The lowest frequency produced by any known geological process, tectonic infrasound, is approximately 0.01 hertz. The Kelvarn Glacier was vibrating at a frequency 70 times higher than tectonic infrasound and nearly 30 times lower than the threshold of human hearing. It occupied a frequency band that is, in the acoustic literature, empty. Nothing natural produces sound at 0.7 hertz. Nothing geological. Nothing meteorological, nothing biological, in any species documented by the University of Arranmore or any other institution of which Maren was aware. She calculated the source dimensions. This is the part she did not share with the group, the calculation she performed alone, wrote in her journal, and showed to no one. I know about it because I found the journal entry 30 years later. The physics are straightforward. A resonant body vibrating at a given frequency has a minimum size determined by the relationship between frequency, wavelength, and propagation speed. At 0.7 hertz, transmitting through a medium with the Kelvarn substance's measured propagation characteristics, the source body must have a minimum dimension of approximately 1,100 feet. 1,100 feet. The creature, the organism, the entity, the thing producing the breathing, must be at least 1,100 feet across to generate the frequency Maren measured. The glacier, at its widest, was 1,200 feet across. Maren wrote the number. She looked at it. She closed the journal. I imagine her face, though I did not see it, was not present for this private calculation, and I imagine it as the face she wore at the drill site. Not surprised, but confirmed. The glacier was not sitting on top of something. The glacier was not covering something. The glacier was something. The resonant body and the glacier were the same object. The breathing and the ice were the same entity. What they had been walking on, sleeping on, drilling into, and measuring for 2 days was not a geological formation that contained a living thing. It was a living thing that they had mistaken for a geological formation. Praed attributed the sound to subglacial cavitation. He said the acoustic properties were consistent with large chamber resonance in glacial ice, amplified by the unusual density of the Kelvarn substance. He ordered the dragon sedated with standard field calming protocols, a combination of vocal commands and pharmacological agents applied to the neck glands, designed to suppress adrenal response and restore trained behavioral baselines. The handlers dosed all 12 mounts. The dragons received the sedation. Their eyes dulled, their muscles slackened. The handlers reported success. I checked Voss 30 minutes after sedation. His head was still lowered. His wings were still pressed. His body was chemically calm. The adrenal suppression was working. His heartbeat had slowed. His breathing had regulated. But the subsonic vibration in his throat had not stopped. The sedation had reached his muscles, his adrenal system, his conscious behavioral responses. It had not reached whatever part of him was producing the frequency. That part was deeper than pharmacology. That part was answering a signal that operated below the level of chemistry, below the level of training, below the level of the bond itself. The sedation had quieted his body. His body was not the part that was listening. The camp settled. The riders who had not felt the sound's full impact, those who had been in their tents, those who had not pressed their palms to the ice, those who had accepted Praed's cavitation explanation and the reassurance of sedated dragons, went to sleep. The breathing continued beneath us, a pressure I could feel through my bedroll, through the tent floor, through every layer of fabric and leather and human denial that separated my body from the glacier's surface. I did not sleep. At 0200 on the morning of the 16th, I woke, or rather, I stopped pretending to sleep because the breathing had stopped. The silence was immediate and total, not the silence of a quiet night, not the absence of a sound you have grown accustomed to and notice only when it ends. This was active silence, the silence of something that has been producing sound continuously for 8 hours and has chosen, in a specific instant, to stop. The silence had intentionality. It was not a cessation, it was a decision. I opened my tent. The moonlight was full, a clear sky, no cloud cover. The moon at perhaps 70 degrees above the southern horizon, casting the glacier in blue-white light that gave the ice the appearance of illuminated glass. I could see the picket line from my tent. Every dragon was standing, not the drugged stillness of sedation. Standing, upright, alert. 12 war dragons that had been chemically suppressed to the point of behavioral inertia 4 hours earlier were now standing at full height, heads raised, wings slightly unfurled, not in the submission posture of the previous evening, but in a posture I did not recognize. Not threat, not submission, not alertness. Something between all three. An orientation, a facing. All 12 heads pointed in the same direction, north-northeast, toward the glacier's deep interior with the precision of compass needles responding to a magnetic source. The sedation had failed. Not worn off, the pharmacological timeline was 12 hours minimum, and we were at the 4-hour mark. Failed. Overridden. Whatever had been speaking to the dragons through the glacier's frequency had, in the moment the breathing stopped, reached into the chemical suppression and switched the dragons back on. The calming protocols, field-tested, reliable, standard issue for a decade, had been countermanded by a signal that operated at a level the pharmacologists had never accounted for because they did not know it existed. I stepped out of my tent and onto the ice. The glacier was silent. Not even wind. The air was motionless, cold, heavy with a humidity that had no source. The nearest liquid water was the frozen Sorel, miles to the east. The stillness felt pressurized, as though the atmosphere itself was holding its breath in sympathy with the glacier's silence. I followed the dragon's gaze. I looked north-northeast, toward the glacier's center, toward the grid coordinates Marin had drilled and the glacier had healed, toward the 1,100-foot resonant body that Marin's calculations said occupied the full width of the ice. The surface was different. At the limit of the moonlight, perhaps 500 yards from the camp, perhaps more. Distance was treacherous on the glacier's featureless expanse. The ice was rising, not cracking, not calving, not breaking apart in any of the dramatic, violent modes that glacial ice uses to rearrange itself. Rising, smoothly, slowly, continuously, as though a portion of the glacier's surface was being pushed upward from below. The rising section was broad. I could not see its edges in the moonlight, and it moved with the unhurried certainty of something that was not reacting to a force, but choosing to move. It looked like a shoulder. It looked like something enormous, something that filled the space beneath the glacier the way a body fills a bed, was rolling over in its sleep. Except the breathing had stopped. It was not asleep. It was awake. The ice continued to rise. The dragons watched. I watched. The moonlight caught the rising surface and reflected it in shifting planes as the geometry changed. And I stood on the glacier in the freezing silence, and I understood, not with my training, not with my instruments, not with the rational framework of a 21-year-old military rider, that the thing beneath the ice was not surfacing in response to our presence. It was surfacing because the breathing had stopped. The breathing had been sleep. The silence was wakefulness. We had been camped on it for 2 days. We had drilled into it. We had taken pieces of it. And now, it was waking up. Voss did not make a sound. For the first time since we arrived, the vibration in his throat was gone. He was silent. All 12 dragons were silent. I had heard their vibrations for 2 days, felt them, lived inside them, let them become a background texture of the expedition. Now, nothing. The conversation was over. Whatever the dragons had been saying to the glacier, and whatever the glacier had been saying to the dragons, the exchange had concluded. What came next was not communication. What came next was presence. At 0200 on the morning of the 16th of Greenmere, on a glacier that should not exist in a valley that should have been green, I saw it. I need to be precise. I have told myself for 60 years that precision is the currency of credibility. That if I can render the measurements exact and the sequence verifiable, someone, some future reader of this testimony, some archivist or historian, or simply some person who has looked at an animal and wondered what it knew that they did not, will believe me. I do not need them to believe me the way I need air or water, but I need it the way a man who has carried a stone for 60 years needs to set it down before he dies. So I will be precise. The rising section of Glacier was approximately 500 yards from the camp. It rose from the surface the way a body rises from water, not erupting, not breaking through, but emerging, the ice parting around it like a membrane yielding to pressure from within. The surface did not crack. It did not fracture into plates or calve into blocks the way ice does when force is applied to it from below. It stretched. It thinned and separated and flowed aside with the viscosity of something that was not solid in the way that ice is solid, but was instead the outer layer of something alive, something whose uneasy skin was made of 9,000-year-old cold, and the skin was parting to let the body through. What came through was a shape. I will describe what I could see. I will describe only what I could see. I will not fill the gaps with imagination or memory's tendency to complete a picture that was, in the moment of observation, incomplete. The moonlight illuminated the shape from behind and above, casting its forward surfaces in blue-white light and leaving its interior in shadow. What I saw was a silhouette, but a silhouette with enough reflected detail to establish certain facts. It was bipedal. Two structures that I must call shoulders rose from the glacier's surface, followed by a head and an upper torso. The lower body remained embedded in the ice, not standing on the surface, but continuous with it, as though the shape was not a separate entity resting on the glacier, but a protrusion of the glacier itself, the way a mountain is a protrusion of the Earth's crust. It did not have legs standing on ice. It had an upper body emerging from ice. Below the waist, the shape and the glacier were the same thing. The shoulders were enormous. I estimated their width by triangulating against the mountain ridge behind the shape, whose elevation and distance I knew from the survey charts. The shoulders were approximately 80 feet across. The head, including a structure I will describe in a moment, rose perhaps 40 feet above the shoulders. The total height of the visible portion from the glacier's surface to the top of the head was approximately 120 feet. Voss's maximum flight ceiling in standard atmospheric conditions was 300 feet. The shape was visible well below that ceiling. It was not the largest thing I had seen from Dragonback. The siege towers at the Battle of Ashenmere were taller, but the siege towers were built by human hands, and their scale was the scale of engineering, which is the scale of ambition limited by material. This shape scale was not limited by anything. It was the size it needed to be, and the glacier, its body, its medium, its substance, extended for 1,200 feet in every direction beneath it. What I was seeing was not the creature. It was the creature's head and shoulders. The rest was below me, had been below me for 2 days. The surface texture was glacial. The shoulders were covered in or composed of layered ice, visible in cross-section where the moonlight struck at an angle. Strata of different densities, different opacities, different ages, compressed into anatomy. I could see the layers the way you see growth rings in a cut tree, each one representing a period of accumulation, a season, a century, a millennium. The creature's shoulders were a geological record. Its body was its own history, written in ice, and the history went back further than the mountains that surrounded it. A mane or crest of ice formations rose from the head and cascaded down the back of the neck, enormous crystalline structures, each one the size of a mature oak, catching the moonlight and refracting it into spectral fragments that scattered across the glacier's surface like the light from a shattered prism. The mane moved not in wind, because there was no wind, but in the way that hair moves on a body that is turning its head. Slowly, the ice crystals shifted and resettled as the head oriented. It was orienting toward the camp, and in the area where a face should be below the mane, between the shoulders, in the shadowed hollow where moonlight did not reach 2 points of red light, not glowing. I must be precise about this because the word glowing implies luminescence, a cold emission, something phosphorescent or bioluminescent or otherwise explicable by the chemistry of light production. These were not glowing. They were warm. They emitted red light the way a forge emits red light through heat, through genuine thermal radiation. 2 points of warmth in a body made of 9,000-year-old cold. They were the oldest living light I have ever seen. They were eyes. The shape stood or existed, or was present, because stood implies legs and volition, and the shape simply was there, emerging from the glacier the way a thought emerges from a mind, and it looked at the camp, at us, at 16 people and 12 dragons on the surface of its body. The camp erupted, not into chaos, into the disciplined emergency of trained military personnel, encountering a threat that exceeds their manual. Predating was out of his tent in seconds, shouting orders. Defensive perimeter. Lances charged. 3 riders to mount immediately. The senior riders Hallen, Druve, Sevik ran for the picket line. Marin was behind them, not running for a dragon but running toward Predating, shouting that they needed to leave, not fight. Leave now. That what she had calculated from the sonic data matched what she was seeing. That the glacier was not a formation containing a creature. It was a body, and the body was waking, and they were standing on it. Predating did not hear her, or he heard her, and filed it in a drawer I will never understand. He continued ordering the defensive perimeter. Lances, dragons, formation. Torek did not run. Torek walked slowly, calmly, with the measured pace of a man performing a ritual he has rehearsed in his mind for 60 years, to the nearest open space on the glacier's surface, and he knelt. He did not kneel toward the shape. He knelt toward the ice. He pressed his forehead to the surface, to the body, to the skin of the thing beneath us, and he spoke a word. I was close enough to hear it. I did not understand it. It was in the Kelvarn shepherd's dialect, a word I had never encountered in any language I knew. Torek spoke it once, clearly, without raising his voice, pressing his forehead to the ice, as though the word was meant to travel through the glacier's substance and reach the entity directly. He stayed in that position, kneeling, head bowed, forehead on ice, and did not move again. Not when the riders mounted. Not when the lances charged. Not during what came after. 30 years later, I returned to the Kelvarn Basin. Torek was dead. His granddaughter, Sarah, was keeping sheep on the slopes above Greyvale, in the same pastures her family had worked for 10 generations. I found her and asked about the word. She told me. The word was something between landlord and the one to whom the ground answers, but not in the property sense, she said. Not the way a tenant acknowledges an owner who can evict. In the deeper sense, the ground answers to it. The stone, the cold, the mountain. The geography itself is a function of the entity's presence. The word meant, roughly, the authority from which the land takes its instructions. I did not know this at 0200 on the morning of the 16th. I knew only that Torek was kneeling and speaking to the ice, and the shape was standing in the moonlight, and Predating was ordering a defensive formation, and Marin was screaming at Predating, and 3 riders were trying to mount their dragons, and the dragons were not cooperating. The dragons. I must describe the dragons. All 12 were in the posture I mentioned, upright, heads raised, wings slightly unfurled, oriented toward the shape. When the riders reached the picket line and began to mount, the dragons did not resist. They did not buck or snap or refuse the harness the way a panicked animal refuses handling. They simply did not adjust. A war dragon, when a rider mounts, shifts its weight. It spreads its stance. It adjusts its wing angle for the rider's center of gravity. It is a collaborative act. The mount accommodates the rider, and the rider settles into the accommodation. These 12 dragons did not accommodate. They stood as they were, oriented toward the shape, and the riders climbed onto them the way a man climbs onto a boulder, without assistance, without acknowledgement, without the animal partner reciprocity that every mounted minute of a bonded rider's life depends on. Hallen mounted first. His dragon, a 17-year-old iron scale named Kor, did not turn its head. Hallen kicked gently, the standard ascent signal. Kor did not move. Hallen kicked harder. Kor's wings did not unfurl for flight. Hallen pulled the reins left, commanding a turn. Kor's head did not move. Kor was looking at the shape. Kor was looking at the shape with the fixed, unblinking focus I had seen in juvenile dragons at the breeding grounds when a wild alpha crossed the thermal column. Hierarchical acknowledgement. Not fear, not submission, recognition. The dragon was seeing something it knew not from experience, not from training, but from somewhere deeper, from the part of its biology that 9,000 years of glacial patience could still reach, from the part that harmonized. Then the shape sank, slowly, the same unhurried certainty with which it had risen. The shoulders descended, the head lowered, the red eyes dimmed, not extinguished, but submerged, their light filtering through increasing thickness of ice as the shape receded into the glacier's body. The mane of ice crystals settled and merged with the surface. The glacier re-leveled. The ice smoothed over the place where the shape had been, and within 30 seconds, the surface was featureless again. White, flat, unbroken, as though nothing had emerged, as though a 120-foot silhouette with red eyes and geological strata for skin had not just stood in the moonlight and looked at us. The breathing resumed, 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, as though the waking had been momentary. A sleeper roused, a glance at the room, a return to rest. Prade's voice cut through the aftermath. He declared the event a calving event, a large ice shelf, detached from the glacier's subsurface by thermal differential, tilting upward through the surface layer and producing a visual artifact amplified by moonlight and observer fatigue. He said the red light was refracted moonlight passing through iron oxide deposits in the ice. He said the human shape was pareidolia, the brain's tendency to impose familiar patterns on ambiguous stimuli. He ordered the camp to stand down. He said they would complete the survey at first light and extract by midday. Hallen dismounted. Druves dismounted. Sevik dismounted. The riders returned to their tents. Some of them, I believe, accepted Prade's explanation. The calving event framework was available, and Prade's voice was certain. And the alternative was something the 21-year-old riders in a military formation were not equipped to process at 2 in the morning on a glacier that was breathing beneath them. Some of them believed Prade, because believing Prade was easier than believing what they had seen. I did not return to my tent. I stood at the picket line beside Voss, and I pressed my forehead to his neck the way Torek had pressed his forehead to the ice. I realized now, and I felt his heartbeat. Slow, steady, calmer than it had been in days. The vibration in his throat was back, soft. The conversation resumed. But his posture had changed. The hierarchical acknowledgement was gone. In its place was something I did not have a name for at 21, and have spent 60 years trying to name. Voss had seen the shape. He had seen it rise and look and sink. And his response was not fear, not submission, not the frantic alertness of an animal assessing a threat. His response was settlement. He was calmer now than he had been since we arrived, as though the seeing had resolved something, as though the uncertainty of the previous 2 days, the listening, the vibrating, the downward gaze, had been the stress, and the shape's appearance had been the answer. Voss knew what was beneath us. He had known since the ridge. And now he had seen it, and the seeing was not frightening. The seeing was confirming. I was not confirmed. I was terrified. And the distance between my terror and Voss's calm was the distance between a man and his dragon that I had not known existed, the gap in our bond that no amount of flight hours could close. Because it was not a gap of trust or skill or intimacy, but a gap of biology. Voss's species had a relationship with the thing beneath the glacier that my species did not. That relationship predated me. It would outlast me. And I was standing in the dark, pressing my face to the neck of an animal I had believed I understood completely, learning for the first time that the deepest part of him was a room I had never entered and could not enter and was not welcome in. Marin found me at the picket line. She approached from behind and spoke quietly so the camp would not hear. She said, "I need to show you something." She opened her journal to a page she had drawn on quickly, in the minutes after the shape sank, while the details were fresh. A sketch, a naturalist sketch, done with the trained hand of a woman who had documented geological formations on 4 continents. The sketch showed the shape, the shoulders, the head, the mane, the 2 points where the red eyes had been. Below it, on the same page, was a second drawing. The borehole site from the previous day, mapped onto the glacier's survey grid with distances and orientations carefully noted. She held the journal so the moonlight illuminated both drawings. She pointed to the borehole site on the grid map. Then she pointed to the shape's left shoulder on the sketch. She had overlaid the 2 drawings using the survey grid as a common reference. The borehole site, the place where she had drilled 2 18-inch cores into the glacier's substance, the place where the cores had been warm. The place that had healed overnight corresponded precisely to the left shoulder of the silhouette. She said, "We drilled into its shoulder velen. The core samples were warm because they were tissue. It healed because it is alive. And it let us drill. It felt us penetrate its body. And it did not react. It waited until we were finished, and it repaired the wound. And it said nothing. Do you understand what that means? It means it knew. It knew we were drilling into it, and it allowed it. The restraint required to feel an intrusion and not respond, to let a foreign body penetrate your tissue and simply wait. I do not have a framework for that. I do not have a category for a living thing that exercises that degree of control over its own defensive response." She closed the journal. She looked at me. She said, "The samples are in my case. They're still warm. They're pieces of it. We are carrying pieces of a living organism that chose not to stop us from taking them. I do not know what we owe for that, but I think the glacier knows." On the evening of the 16th of Greenmere, the 3rd evening, the last evening, the evening I have returned to every night for 60 years, in the space between wakefulness and sleep, the Icewalker rose again. I must stop calling it the shape. It was not a shape. Shapes are visual categories, abstractions imposed by the eye on ambiguous stimuli. What rose from the glacier on the evening of the 16th was not ambiguous. It was specific. It was an entity ancient, territorial, intelligent, composed of the glacier's substance, emerging from its own body the way a hand emerges from beneath a blanket. It rose because it chose to rise. Not in response to a stimulus, not because we provoked it. It rose because the sun went down, and the moon came up, and the 16th of Greenmere was the night it had designated if a 9,000-year-old intelligence designates. If designation is even the right framework for a mind that operates on a time scale that makes human planning look like the reflexive twitch of an insect for the encounter that would determine whether we left the glacier alive. I do not know this. I am interpreting. I am an 81-year-old man in a sanatorium bed, reconstructing motive for something I struck in the face, and that looked at me for 11 seconds, and I still do not understand what it was thinking. But I believe the timing was deliberate. I believe the first rising at 0200 was an assessment, and I believe the second rising at dusk was a decision. It was closer. This is the detail that collapsed the last of my rational architecture, the last load-bearing wall of the framework Prade had built and I had sheltered inside. It was closer. At 0200, the shape had risen 500 yards from the camp. At dusk, it was, I estimated. I measured as best I could with distance markers and angular comparison and the desperate arithmetic of a man trying to keep numbers between himself and terror. Approximately 200 yards. 300 yards closer. Without moving. Or the camp had moved. The glacier had shifted beneath us. During the day I had felt nothing, measured nothing, noticed no displacement, and the camp was now 300 yards closer to the glacier's center. The entity had not approached us. The ice had carried us to it. Its body had rearranged itself to close the distance, and we had been standing on its surface and had not felt the transit. This possibility was, if anything, more disturbing than a simple approach. It meant the glacier could relocate anything on its surface without the object's knowledge or consent. It meant geography was negotiable. It meant the ground we stood on was not fixed. The Icewalker rose from the waist up. As before, the glacier's surface parting in that same impossible membrane yield, ice flowing aside like water from the shoulders of something surfacing from a deep pool. But at 200 yards, in the golden-red light of sunset and the blue-white light of the rising moon, I could see details the midnight sighting had not permitted. The ice strata on its shoulders were not uniform. They were layered in a way that told time, thicker bands of dense blue ice, alternating with thin bands of white. The pattern repeating in cycles I could count if I had the steadiness to count. Each cycle representing, if the core sample's age was any guide, centuries. Hundreds of centuries. The creature's shoulders were an archive, a record written in ice of every cold season it had endured, every warm season it had survived, every era of the world it had watched from beneath the valley floor. It carried its own history on its body the way a tree carries its years in rings, except the rings went back 9,000 years, and the tree was standing up and looking at me. The arms hung at its sides. They were proportional, long, heavy, tapered at the wrist to hands I could now see. Fingers. It had fingers. Each one approximately the length of Voss's wingspan. 11 feet articulated at 3 visible joints, tapered to blunt tips, encased in frost that moved. The frost on its fingers was not static. It shifted and resettled as the fingers moved, small movements, the unconscious adjustments of a hand at rest, the kind of minute articulation that implies fine motor control, implies dexterity, implies a nervous system capable of precision at a scale where each finger could pick up a human the way I might pick up a coin. The red eyes were open. At 200 yards, they were visible as sources of light, not reflected, not refracted, generated. Thermal light, heat. The creature's body was 9,000-year-old cold, except for those eyes, which were alive with warmth the way a hearth is alive, in a stone house. They looked at the camp. They did not scan. They did not sweep. They settled. They found us, and they held. Its mouth was open. I could see the mouth because the dusk light entered it and did not come back. The mouth was a space, an aperture, in the lower face, below the eyes, between structures that might have been cheekbones or might have been glacial ridges shaped by the same force that shaped everything else about this creature into something almost recognizable, and therefore more terrifying than if it had looked like nothing I had ever seen. The mouth was open, and inside it was not teeth, not tongue, not the anatomical furniture of a biological oral cavity. Inside it was depth. A darkness that extended further than the head was wide, further than the body was deep. A space inside the creature that was larger than the creature's exterior, as though the mouth was an opening, not into a throat, but into the glacier itself, into the full 1,100-foot body beneath the ice, into the archive, into 9,000 years of cold and silence, and patient waiting. Prade did not call it a calving event this time. He stood at the edge of the camp, 30 feet from his tent, and he looked at the Icewalker, and I watched the drawers in his mind fly open one by one and find nothing inside that could contain what he was seeing. I watched him try. I watched his lips move. Subglacial, cavitation, thermal, calving. And I watched each word die before it reached his voice, because the thing in front of him was 200 yards away and 120 feet tall, and it had eyes and no word in his vocabulary applied. He convened a briefing. His voice was steady. I will grant him that his voice was steady, and his orders were clear, and his training held, even as his understanding disintegrated. He said, "We are a military survey. We have encountered an unknown territorial entity of siege-class scale. Our orders are to survey and, if necessary, neutralize threats to the Kelvarn Basin's habitability. I am classifying this entity as a threat. 5 riders will mount and execute a thermal lance assault at my command. Standard siege creature protocol. Concentrated strikes on the head. Holland leads. Velen, you are second." Marin stepped forward. She spoke to Prade with the same controlled precision she had used at the borehole site. The same deliberate word selection, the same awareness that every syllable had to carry the weight of a truth the listener was not equipped to receive. She said, and I quote her exactly, "Because the words have lived in me for 60 years, occupying a space adjacent to Voss's memory and Torek's kneeling, and the 11 seconds of eye contact that I will describe when I reach them," she said. "You do not attack geography, Commandant. You do not declare war on a mountain. You especially do not declare war on a mountain that can look at you." Prade did not respond to her. He turned to the riders. He gave the order. 5 riders, thermal lances, formation assault. Torek stood. He had been sitting at the glacier's edge. He had not set foot on the deep ice since the first morning, had conducted his role as guide from the boundary, sleeping at the tree line, entering the glacier only far enough to reach the camp, and then returning to solid ground each evening. He stood, and he looked at the 5 riders walking to the picket line, and he said, not loudly, not to any one person, but into the air between us, like a man dropping a stone into water, and watching the ripples, and knowing that the ripples will reach the shore whether anyone is watching or not, he said, "The old code has a protocol for this too. It lets you strike it. It lets you learn what your strike accomplishes, and then it decides. The decision is not yours." He walked to the glacier's edge. He sat down with his back to the dead white ash. He faced the valley. He did not turn around. Marin grabbed my arm as I walked to Voss. She said, "It is not a creature, Velen. It is a feature, a geological feature that is alive. You do not attack geography." I said nothing. I was 21. I had orders. I had a lance. I had training that told me a threat of siege-class scale is engaged with concentrated thermal strikes to the cranial area, and I had 4 years of bond with the dragon, who could outfly anything in the division. And I was afraid, and I was trained, and the 2 conditions were, at 21, indistinguishable. I reached Voss. He was standing at his tether, facing the Icewalker, not in submission, not in acknowledgement, in something I will call communion. He was looking at the Icewalker the way the Icewalker's eyes had settled on the camp, with a focus that was not aggressive, not passive, but present. Fully, completely, wholly present. Voss was seeing the thing he had been listening to for 2 days. The source of the frequency, the author of the signal, the elder whose voice had reached into his biology and spoken in a language older than the bond. And he was not afraid. He was, and I reach for this word knowing it will sound absurd applied to an animal, knowing that the bonding manuals do not contain it, knowing that 60 years of trying to explain it has not made it more credible. He was home, looking at the Icewalker. Voss had the posture of an animal that has found something it has been searching for without knowing it was searching. I mounted. Voss did not accommodate me. His weight did not shift. His wings did not adjust. I climbed onto him the way I had climbed boulders as a child, with effort, without assistance, without the collaborative grace that defined every other mounted moment of my life. I kicked for ascent. Voss did not move. Voss was seeing the thing he had been listening to for 2 days. The source of the frequency, the author of the signal, the elder whose voice had reached into his biology and spoken in a language older than the bond. And he was not afraid. He was, and I reach for this word knowing it will sound absurd applied to an animal, knowing that the bonding manuals do not contain it, knowing that 60 years of trying to explain it has not made it more credible. He was home, looking at the Icewalker. Voss had the posture of an animal that has found something it has been searching for without knowing it was searching. I mounted. Voss did not accommodate me. His weight did not shift. His wings did not adjust. I climbed onto him the way I had climbed boulders as a child, with effort, without assistance, without the collaborative grace that defined every other mounted moment of my life. I kicked for ascent. Voss did not move. I kicked again, harder. The combat signal urgent, non-negotiable, the kick that means now, no deliberation. We go now. Voss's muscles did not engage. His wings did not unfurl. He stood on the ice, and he looked at the Icewalker, and he did not move, because the Icewalker was there, and the Icewalker was more important than anything I had ever asked of him. I forced him. I have not said this in any previous version. I have not said it to the inquest, not to the archivist who visited in 1463, not to the military historian who wrote to me in 1477. I have not said it because it is the second worst thing I did on the Kelvarn Glacier, surpassed only by the lance strike itself, and I have been carrying the shame of it for 60 years, and I'm setting it down now, because I'm dying, and Voss is dead. And the truth is that I forced my dragon to fly. I dug my heels into his flanks, not the trained signal, not the calibrated pressure of bonded communication, but the crude, painful, desperate force of a rider overriding his mount's will through physical domination. I hauled the reins upward, pulling his head from the Icewalker, twisting his neck away from the thing he wanted to look at. I shouted to the command voice, the dominant vocalization, the sound that bonding protocol says a dragon cannot disobey. Voss screamed, not in pain. I know his pain sounds the sharp bark of a wing joint sprain, the low hiss of a scale abrasion. This was not pain. This was protest, a sound I had never heard from him, a vocalization that was not in any training manual, a cry that came from the same place the subsonic frequency had come, from the deep biology, the phylogenetic layer, the part of Voss that knew the Icewalker and did not want to fight it, and was telling me, in the only language he had left after I had overridden his body, that what I was doing is wrong. I did not stop. I pulled harder. I kicked harder. And Voss, my Voss, the dragon who had deliberated for 4 seconds before choosing me, who had never refused a command in 4,000 hours of flight, who had trusted me as I had trusted him. Voss unfurled his wings and rose from the glacier because I had left him no choice. I had taken the choice from him. I had used force to override the deepest instinct he possessed. And he flew because his body answered to the physical commands, even when his mind was screaming that the commands were wrong. We rose. The Icewalker was ahead of us. The other 4 riders were airborne. Hallan, Druvis, Sevik, and a rider named Kalun, whose dragon had mounted without resistance, because Kalun's dragon was young and poorly bonded and did not have Voss's depth of conviction. We formed up, thermal lances extended. The tips were glowing 8,000 degrees, superheated ceramic composite designed to penetrate siege-class armor plate and deliver thermal energy directly into organic tissue. The lance in my hand was warm. The Icewalker's eyes were warm. Everything else was cold. The charge began. Voss flew because I commanded him to fly. His wings beat because his muscles answered my kicks. His trajectory was true because his training held even through his protest. He was the fastest dragon in the formation, and I was in the lead because I was the youngest and the most reckless, and I had not yet learned the lesson that Voss had been teaching me since the valley rim, that there are things in the world that your lance cannot touch, not because they are armored, because they are above you, above your fire, above your training, above your bond and your courage, and your 8,000 degrees, above everything you think you are. I flew at the Icewalker's face. I closed the distance. The red eyes grew. The ice mane filled the sky above me. The mouth, the depth, the darkness, the opening into 9,000 years was below the eyes, and I could feel the cold radiating from it. Not the cold of ice, but the cold of time. The cold of something so old that its presence lowered the temperature of the air through sheer antiquity. I raised the lance. Voss's heartbeat, through the saddle, through my thighs, through the bone-deep connection of 4 years, faster than I had ever felt it. Not combat speed, beyond combat speed. The heartbeat of an animal in the presence of something it recognizes as above it on every hierarchy that exists, forced to charge by a rider who does not understand what he is charging. I will tell you what the lance accomplished. I struck the Icewalker in the face. The thermal lance made contact between the eyes, in the space where a human would have a bridge of nose, in the space where the red warmth of the left eye almost touched the red warmth of the right. The lance was rated for 8,000 degrees at the contact point. It was designed to penetrate 12 inches of siege-class bone plate. It had been tested against dragon-scale composite, against fortress stonework, against the laminated chitin armor of the Ashenmere tunnel beetles, that the military classified as the hardest organic surface known to the aerial corps. The lance could kill anything the 6th Aerial Division had ever encountered. I drove it forward with the full momentum of Voss's dive speed, 140 miles per hour at the point of contact. The combined kinetic energy of a 1,200-pound dragon and a 170-pound rider focused through a ceramic tip the diameter of a man's fist, and the lance hit the Icewalker's face, and I felt the impact travel up the shaft through my gauntlets, into my arms and shoulders and spine, and I knew, in the first tenth of a second, that I had struck something that did not recognize the blow, not absorbed, not deflected, not resisted, did not recognize. There was a flash, white gold, brief, the thermal energy of 8,000 degrees releasing against a surface that should have deformed or melted or fractured or burned and did none of these things. The flash lasted less than a second. It illuminated the Icewalker's face from within, the thermal energy passing through the surface frost and lighting the interior structure like a lantern held inside a sculpture. And for that fraction of a second I saw the face from the inside. I saw the strata, the layers, the 9,000-year archive compressed into features that were almost a face. I saw time, not time passing, time stored. Every cold season, every warm season, every era of the world laid down in translucent bands of ice that were not ice, recording the history of a planet on the face of something that had been watching from below the ground since before the ground existed. Then the flash died. The surface frost at the impact site, a circle approximately 3 feet across, centered between the eyes, darkened. I watched it darken. I counted. 1 second. The frost was discolored, gray-black, the thermal signature of material that has absorbed extreme heat. 2 seconds. The discoloration lightened, the gray-black fading to gray, to white-gray, the frost reforming from the edges inward like a wound closing. 3 seconds. The frost was seamless, white, undamaged, indistinguishable from the surrounding surface. The 8,000-degree lance strike had darkened 3 square feet of the Icewalker's face for 3 seconds, and then the face had healed, and the lance's entire thermal output, the weapon's total destructive capacity, the killing force of the most powerful armament the aerial corps had ever fielded, had dissipated into the creature's mass the way a match disappears into a lake. Total energy transfer. Zero effect. The match does not hurt the lake. The lake does not notice the match. The lance accomplished nothing. Voss was still flying. His wings were beating. The dive had carried us past the impact point, and we were climbing on the recovery arc, pulling up and away from the Icewalker's face. And I was holding a lance that was now inert, the thermal charge spent, the ceramic tip cold, the weapon reduced to a metal pole in the hands of a man who had just struck something that was older than the mountains, with everything his civilization could produce, and had not left a mark. The other 4 riders were behind me. They had not struck. Hallen, in the second position, had begun his dive and pulled out. I learned later that Kor, his dragon, had refused the final approach, banking hard left at 70 yards and overriding Hallen's directional commands with a force that nearly unseated him. Druves and Sevik had not begun their dives. Their dragons had slowed to a hover, an aerodynamically demanding maneuver that war dragons perform only under extreme stress. The wing beat equivalent of a horse planting its hooves and refusing to advance. Callan, the youngest after me, was circling at 200 yards, his poorly bonded mount drifting in a wide arc that Kalun could not correct because the dragon was no longer accepting corrections. I was the only one who had struck. I was the only one whose dragon had carried the charge to completion. And Voss had carried it not because he agreed, not because his instincts permitted it, not because the bond held at the critical moment. He had carried it because I had forced him, because I had kicked and hauled and overridden his scream of protest with physical dominance. He had flown the charge under compulsion, and the compulsion had delivered us to the Icewalker's face, and the lance had accomplished nothing. On the recovery arc, climbing away from the face, I felt Voss change, not gradually, not incrementally. A single shift, complete, total, structural in the animal beneath me. His wing beat altered. The rhythm slowed. The desperate, protest-laden beating of a dragon forced into a charge he rejected became something else. Smooth even, deliberate. His neck straightened, his head lifted. His muscles, which had been fighting me and obeying me simultaneously for the entire approach, went quiet. Not slack, not surrendering. Deciding. Voss was making a choice. The last choice he would make on the Kelvarn Glacier. The choice that taught me, in the span of 6 seconds of controlled descent, everything I had failed to learn in 4 years of bond. He folded his wings. I did not command this. I want that recorded. I want it in this testimony with the same weight I have given the measurements and the dates and the temperatures. I did not tell Voss to fold his wings. I did not signal a descent. I did not shift my weight or adjust the reins or produce any input that a bonded dragon would interpret as a landing command. Voss folded his wings on his own authority in the air above the glacier, 200 yards from the Icewalker's face, at an altitude of approximately 150 feet. He folded his wings and he descended. Not a dive, not a combat drop, not the controlled emergency descent a dragon executes when injured or when its rider is incapacitated. Voss descended the way a leaf descends, slowly, smoothly, with a grace that was not aerodynamic but intentional. He spread his wings just enough to control the rate. He adjusted his angle with micro-movements so precise that I could not feel them through the saddle. He brought us down to the glacier's surface in a spiral so gentle that the landing, when it came, was the softest I had ever experienced on Voss's back. Softer than training landings. Softer than display landings. The landing of a dragon who is not obeying gravity or commands, but is choosing to return to the ground because the ground is where he needs to be. His claws touched the ice. I felt the contact through the saddle, a faint vibration. The resumption of the glacier's frequency transmitted through Voss's body and into mine. He was back on the surface. He was back on the body of the thing I had just struck. And the moment his claws made contact, Voss did something I had never seen a war dragon do outside a hatching den. He lay down, flat, head on the ice. Wings spread, pressed to the surface on either side of his body like open hands laid palm down on a table. Legs folded beneath him. Tail curled against his flank. Complete, total, absolute submission, not the juvenile posture of the previous evening, which was a reflexive crouch, a biological shorthand for hierarchical acknowledgement. This was deeper. This was voluntary. Voss was not reacting to a stimulus. He was performing an act. He was pressing his body to the glacier's surface, to the Icewalker's body, with the deliberateness of Torek pressing his forehead to the ice, with the same reverence, the same word, spoken in a different language, through a different body, to the same listener. I was still in the saddle. Voss's descent pressed me forward, my chest against his neck, my face inches from the glacier's surface, through Voss, through his scales, through the muscle and bone beneath, through the 1,200 pounds of living animal between me and the ice. I could feel the glacier's pulse, not the breathing, the pulse, the deeper rhythm, the heartbeat of the 1,100-foot body that Marin had calculated and that I was now lying on, separated from it by only the thickness of my dragon's belly. The pulse was slow, slower than the breathing, a beat every 30 seconds, a heart, if it was a heart, that contracted once every half-minute, pumping whatever circulated inside a body made of 9,000-year-old cold through channels I would never see, to organs I would never understand, serving a biology that predated every living thing on the surface of the world by millennia. I understood in that moment what Voss had been trying to tell me since the valley rim. The downward gaze, the refusal to sleep, the harmonizing, the hesitation on commands, the scream of protest when I forced the charge. Every signal, every behavior, every deviation from 4 years of perfect partnership had been Voss saying the same thing, in the only language available to him. There is something beneath us that I recognize. It is above me. It is above you. It is above everything. Do not fight it. Do not challenge it. When we land, I will show you what to do. And now he was showing me. He was lying on the ice, with his head down, and his wings spread, and his body pressed to the surface of something ancient and alive. And he was not surrendering, and he was not submitting, and he was not afraid. He was acknowledging, the way a young wolf lowers its head when it enters a territory that is owned. Not fear, not defeat, protocol. The protocol that Torek knew and the wild stonebacks knew, and every dragon on the picket line, White knew, and that I trained, armed, bonded, 21 years old, and certain that my lance could kill anything, did not know. The other dragons followed. All of them. The 4 in the air. Hallin's core, Druv's mount, Sevik's mount, Kalun's mount, descended to the glacier's surface within seconds of Voss. They did not land the way Voss had landed. They came down faster, less gracefully, some of them stumbling on the ice. But they came down, and the 8 on the picket line, still tethered, lay down where they were. 12 dragons on the glacier's surface, pressed flat, heads down, wings spread. 12 simultaneous acts of acknowledgement performed without a single human command. 5 saddles were empty. I do not know when it happened. I did not see it. One moment, there were 5 riders in the air. Hallin, Druviz, Sevik, Kalun, and a rider named Perek, who had mounted last and flown widest. The next moment, their dragons were on the ice, and their saddles were vacant. The harnesses were buckled, the lances were stowed. The riders were not on them. 5 men, 5 living men, who had been airborne seconds earlier, were gone. Not fallen. I would have seen a fall. Not thrown. The harnesses were buckled, and a thrown rider leaves a buckle torn or a strap snapped, and these were intact. The 5 riders had been removed. Lifted from their saddles, passed through buckled harnesses without disturbing them, and taken, somewhere, into the ice, into the glacier, into the body of the thing that Marin said was alive, and that had just demonstrated in the space between one wing beat and the next, that it could reach into the air and take what it chose and leave no evidence of the taking, except an empty saddle and a calm dragon. 5 men, gone. The 5 dragons stood on the ice, not distressed, not grieving, not exhibiting a single one of the 16 documented behavioral indicators of rider loss. They stood in the positions where they had landed, head slightly raised, wings folded, posture neutral, waiting. The way you wait at a door for someone who has stepped inside and told you they will be back. But they would not be back. I knew this. I knew it the way Voss knew the Icewalker was there before we saw it, not through evidence, not through deduction, but through a knowledge that arrived whole and complete and irrefutable, deposited in my mind by the 11 seconds of eye contact that I have not yet described and must now describe, because they are the center of this testimony and the center of my life, and the reason I'm telling the truth for the first time in 60 years. The Icewalker looked at me after the lance strike, after the flash and the 3-second heel and the descent and Voss lying down and the 5 empty saddles. The Icewalker adjusted its gaze downward, slightly, from the altitude where I had struck it to the surface of the glacier, where I now lay on Voss's back, and it looked at me. The red eyes found me, not the camp, not the dragons, not the surviving riders. Me, the one who had struck, the one whose lance had touched its face and whose dragon was lying on its body and whose life was, by any rational assessment, entirely in its power. 11 seconds. I counted. God help me, I counted. The training, the precision, the obsessive measurement that had been my only tool and my only comfort on this glacier. I counted the seconds of eye contact with something that had been alive since before the mountains existed. I counted because counting was all I had. Because if I did not count, the moment would become infinite, would expand beyond the boundaries of experience into something I could not carry. And I needed it to have a number. I needed the most important moment of my life to be measurable. So I counted. 1. The eyes were warm. I said this before, and I am saying it again. Because at 30 feet, Voss had landed 30 feet from the Icewalker's face, close enough to see the strata in its cheeks, close enough to feel the heat from its eyes on my own face at 30 feet. The warmth was physical. I could feel it. 2 points of thermal radiation in a body made of cold, and they were the temperature of a humanly hand, and they were looking at me. 2, 3. The eyes did not blink. They did not narrow. They did not widen. They were steady, patient, the patience of something that has looked at small things on its surface for 9,000 years and will look at small things on its surface for 9,000 more. 4, 5. I was not breathing. I know this because when the 11 seconds ended, I gasped a sharp, involuntary inhalation that hurt my lungs. The gasp of a man who has forgotten to breathe and whose body has overridden his paralysis to keep him alive. 6, 7. The eyes shifted, not in direction. They were still looking at me, but in quality. The red dimmed, not extinguished, softened, the way a forge dims when the bellows stop. The heat was still there. The light was still there. But the intensity decreased. And what replaced intensity was something I have spent 60 years trying to name, and have failed every time, and will fail now, but I must try, because this is my last testimony, and the word matters. Recognition, not personal recognition. It did not know me. I was not special. I was not chosen. The recognition was categorical. It had seen riders before. It had seen lances before. It had seen the small, hot things on the surface of its body raise their weapons and strike its face before, perhaps dozens of times across the millennia, perhaps hundreds. And the lance strike and the rider and the dragon and the charge were not new to it. I was not an event. I was a recurrence, a pattern. The way rain is a pattern. The way seasons are a pattern. Small things strike, the ice heals, the small things leave, or they do not. The glacier remains. 8, 9, 10. The eyes held, the recognition held, and I understood lying on Voss's back, on the glacier's surface, on the body of something that could close its hand around me and my dragon and crush us both without elevating its heartbeat, that the Icewalker was not deciding whether to kill me. It had never been deciding whether to kill me. The question of killing me was so far beneath its consideration that the concept did not apply. I was rain. You do not decide whether to kill rain. You do not consider rain. Rain happens. Rain ends. The ground remains. 11. The Icewalker lowered its gaze, not away from me, through me, past me, down. Its eyes moved from my position on the surface to the surface itself, to the ice, to its own body, and the lowering felt like being set down, like being placed gently on a shelf by a hand so large that the placing was indistinguishable from stillness. I was not dismissed. Dismissal implies consideration followed by rejection. I was released from attention, the way you stop watching rain, not because you have decided against the rain, because the rain does not require your attention. It looked at me the way you look at rain. The Icewalker sank. The ice closed over its shoulders. The red eyes descended and dimmed and disappeared beneath the surface. The mane of ice crystals settled and flattened and merged with the glacier's skin. The breathing resumed 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, and the glacier was a glacier again, white and flat and featureless, and the Icewalker was gone. Below us, around us, beneath us, gone the way a thought goes when the thinker turns to other things, not absent, inattentive. The glacier opened. A channel appeared in the ice, not a crack, not a crevasse, not the violent fracture that ice produces under stress. A channel, smooth-walled, wide enough for a dragon to walk with wings folded, running from the camp's position to the glacier's southern edge, to the tree line, to Torek, to solid ground. The channel had not been there before. It had not formed through any process I could identify. The glacier's surface had rearranged. The ice had moved aside, had created a corridor through the Icewalker's own body, and was holding it open. A door, held open by the thing we had struck, for the people who had struck it. I dismounted. My legs did not hold me, and I knelt on the ice, not the way Torek had knelt, not with reverence, but with the gracelessness of a body that had been rigid for 11 seconds and could no longer support its own weight. I knelt, and I placed my palms on the glacier's surface, on the skin of the creature, and I felt the pulse, 1 beat every 30 seconds, and I understood that I was alive because the Icewalker had chosen not to change that, not because my lance had failed, not because Voss had landed, not because of anything I had done or anyone had done. I was alive because the thing beneath the ice had looked at me and seen rain, and turned its attention to other things. Voss stood. He folded his wings. He walked toward the channel. I followed him. I did not mount. I walked beside my dragon, my hand on his neck, and I felt his heartbeat calm, steady, slower than it had been in days. The vibration in his throat was gone. The frequency was silent. The conversation was over. The surviving riders and ground crew followed. Marin walked beside me for a time, her sample case on her shoulder. She did not speak. No one spoke. We walked through a corridor of living ice, whose walls pulsed faintly with the breathing rhythm, whose surface was the body of the thing that had chosen not to kill us and was now choosing to let us leave. The 5 riderless dragons did not follow. They stood on the glacier in the positions where they had landed, calm and still and waiting. I looked back once. They had not moved. They were waiting for riders who were inside the glacier now, part of the ice, part of the 9,000-year body, incorporated into the archive the way a season is incorporated, the way a memory is stored, the way rain is absorbed by the ground and becomes, eventually, indistinguishable from it. Torek was sitting at the glacier's edge. He had not moved. His back was against the dead white ash, his staff across his knees, his face turned toward the valley. He did not stand when we emerged from the channel. He counted us. His lips moved. He reached a number and stopped. I said, 5. He said, 5 is the price. You drilled into it, you struck it. 5 is what is owed. It could have taken all of you. 5 is generous. We walked to the valley floor. We did not look back. We did not run. We walked backward off the Ice Torex protocol, followed now without question, without argument, without the drawer-filing rationality that had governed every decision Commandant Prade had made, until the moment he saw the Icewalker's eyes and his filing system collapsed. We walked backward off the glacier, and we turned only when our boots touched grass. I counted the survivors. 7 riders, including myself. 2 ground surveyors. Marin, Torek, 11 people. Prade was among the 7 riders. He did not speak during the walk out. He did not speak during the descent to Greyvale. He filed his report on the 29th of Greenmere. Fog, navigational error, crevasse falls. I countersigned it. We all countersigned it. The drawer was shut for the last time. The 5 riderless dragons were recovered 6 days later by a second expedition dispatched from the eastern garrison. They were standing on the glacier in the same positions. They had not moved. They were not hungry. They were not dehydrated. They were not distressed. They were waiting. The recovery team led them off the ice, and they followed without resistance. They were returned to the division stable and reassigned. None of them accepted a new rider. They lived out their lives unbonded, cared for by handlers, and each of them, all 5, independently, in 5 separate stalls faced north every night. The 4 riders whose memories stopped at day 3, Holland, Druvis, Sevik, and Kalun, lived full lives. They remembered the expedition. They remembered the glacier. They remembered the tracks, the core samples, the breathing. They did not remember the night of the 16th. Their memories resumed on the morning of the 17th in Greyvale, with no recollection of how they arrived. The Icewalker had taken the night from them, not their lives, their witness. Whatever it did to the glacier on the night of the 16th, whatever it decided and whatever it took, it removed the memory from 4 men and left it in only 3. Myself, Marin Duval, and Commandant Prade. And Prade filed his report and never spoke of it again, and died in 1462, without, to my knowledge, ever telling the truth. Marin published no paper. She filed no university report. She kept her journal and her samples the warm cores, the living pieces of the Icewalker's body, and she returned to her office at the University of Arranmore. And she taught glaciology for 30 more years. And she never mentioned the Kelvarn expedition in any lecture, any publication, any correspondence that I have been able to find. I looked. 30 years after the expedition, when I returned to Kelvarn, I searched the university archive for her work. I found her journal fragments of it, pages water-damaged, some entries illegible. But the entry from the night of the 16th was intact. She had written a single line beneath her description of the channel. It let us leave. I do not know what that costs. I suspect we are still paying. The samples were not in the archive. I do not know where they are. I do not know if they are still warm. Voss lived 12 years after the glacier. I retired from the 6th Aerial Division 3 months after the expedition. I could not fly, not because I was injured, because every time I mounted Voss, I felt the moment he folded his wings, the shift, the decision, the authority transferred from rider to dragon, to something beneath the ice, and I could not ask him to obey me again. Not after I had forced him, not after I had kicked and hauled and overridden the deepest wisdom he possessed, to deliver a lance strike that healed in 3 seconds and meant nothing. I kept Voss. I built a stable at the edge of my family's land, in the hills above Brenmouth, as far south as the continent goes. I fed him. I groomed him. I sat beside him in the evenings, and I did not ride him, and he did not ask me to. The bond was still there. I could feel his heartbeat through my palm when I touched his neck, could feel the old rhythm of 4 years of shared flight. But there was something else in the bond now, a room I'd not known existed, a depth behind his eyes that I had never seen before the glacier and could never unsee after. Voss had a relationship with something that I could not participate in. And the relationship was older than me and deeper than me, and it called to him every night from the north. Every night. For 12 years. Voss faced north and produced the sound. The subsonic vocalization. The frequency that matched the glacier's breathing. 4 seconds on. 6 seconds off. Repeating. Patient. Ceaseless. Aimed at a glacier 400 miles to the north that was, as far as I could determine, still there. Still breathing. Still ancient. Still alive. I timed the intervals. Every night for 12 years, I sat beside Voss in the stable, and I pressed my hand to his throat, and I counted. 4 seconds. 6 seconds. The rhythm never varied. Not once. Not in 12 years. Not in summer or winter. Not in health or illness. Not in the gradual slowing of age that took his flight muscles first and then his legs, and finally his ability to stand. Even at the end, lying on the straw in his stable, too weak to raise his head, Voss faced north and vibrated. I was holding his head when he died. His last vocalization was at the northern frequency. 4 seconds in, then silent. Not the active silence of the glacier, the silence of the thing I had spent 60 years pressing my hand to and had lost. I believe Voss was not calling to the glacier. I believe the glacier was calling to Voss. I believe it called to every dragon that had ever set foot on its surface, in a frequency that human ears could not detect and human instruments could barely measure, and that the call was not a summons or a command, but a continuity, a relationship maintained across distance and time. The old cold and the dragons, the landlord and the tenants who knew the language of the land. A bond older than domestication, older than bonding, older than the mountains. A bond that my bond with Voss, 4,000 hours, 4 years. The deepest trust I have ever placed in a living thing could not override, and was never meant to. Voss knew. He knew on the valley rim. He knew before the tracks and the cores and the breathing and the shape. He knew because his species has always known. The Icewalker is not a secret. It is not hidden. It is simply spoken of in a language that humans do not hear, by animals that humans believe they have tamed, in a frequency that passes through our bodies without registering, and has been passing through our bodies since before we built our first wall, or flew our first dragon, or raised our first lance against the things we do not understand. I struck it in the face with everything I had. The lance was rated for 8,000 degrees. The ice healed in 3 seconds. It looked at me for 11. I have been looked at by kings, by generals, by my own children as they were born. Nothing has ever seen me the way that thing saw me. It looked at me the way you look at rain. The glacier is still there. I have checked. Every year for 60 years, I have written to the Kelvarn district office and asked for the survey status of the basin. Every year, the same response. The glacier persists, unchanged, unadvanced, unretreated. The same dimensions recorded by Praed survey in 1431. The same boundary to the foot. Voss is not. The measurements have not changed. Testimony of Edric Velen, Junior Lancer, retired. 6th Aerial Division. Recorded the 9th of Ashfall, 1491. Brenmouth Coastal Sanatorium, 3rd Ward, Room 11. Transcribed by Pell, orderly. Filed in no archive. Found in a bread tin. Read by you. Case file closed.